Statements by ministers.
Mr. Speaker, we have 4 statements scheduled for today by the Honourable Prime Minister, the Honourable Minister of National Security, the Honourable Minister of Justice, and the Minister of Industry, Commerce and Agriculture. So at this time, the Minister of National Security will do a statement.
Yeah. Minister Montague.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The clerk has some copies and they have also been transmitted electronically to persons. We have limited printed copies that are there that will be distributed. Mr. Speaker, I stand to update you on a number of issues pertaining to national security. It is a fact that during the year 2017, 1,616 persons were murdered in Jamaica, and there were 1,469 shootings. However, it is also true that we have had significant reductions in the other 5 major crime categories and collected 859 illegal firearms and 21,764 rounds of illegal ammunition. While we continue to be concerned, and rightly so, about the level of murders, we should not allow that to cause us not to recognize the combined efforts of all the stakeholders in the security sector that have resulted in substantial declines in 5 of the 7 major categories of crime. Notwithstanding the gains, Mr. Speaker, as Minister, I am the first to admit that while we are heartened, we are still not satisfied. Mr. Speaker, since the start of this year, we have continued to see an unacceptable trend in the country's murder rate. Naturally, some have become fearful and frightened. This is not lost on the government, and as such, we have declared a state of emergency in St. James to treat with that particular situation. The security operations, which are in their very early stages, are going very well. So far, the state of emergency has resulted in the detention of 197 persons, the seizure of 4 firearms, and approximately 300 rounds of illegal ammunition. Among the 197 persons detained are 10 men wanted for serious crimes, including murder and shootings. The security forces have also advised that 83 of the 197 persons detained are strongly believed to be connected to gangs in St. James. There are currently 178 persons in custody. Some of these persons are the subject of further investigations. We asked for and are getting unprecedented support from the public. We ask that members of the public continue to flood us with information. Tell us where the guns are. Tell us where the gunmen are. Tell us where the lot of scammers are. Let me hasten to point out that the declaration of a state of emergency is not a panacea. It is not a cure-all for all our problems. It is meant to cauterize the situation while providing the space for other sustainable interventions. Let me remind this Honourable House that it took us decades to get here, and it will not be addressed overnight. In addition to the efforts of the security forces, it will require significant inputs from all facets of our society to sustainably address the problem. There is a significant level of consensus that sustainable crime reduction will require fundamental changes along with significant investment in our social and educational systems. As a government, we are committed to providing these inputs over time. Mr. Speaker, we are aware that criminal elements will attempt to flee St. James to neighboring parishes. As such, a number of operations are being conducted across the island in support of the state of emergency. These operations are in an effort to apprehend wanted men who may have eluded the main area of operations. Divisions within Area 5 conducted a 24-hour blitz which saw increased visibility and intensified operational activities to include VCPs, raids, searches, and visits to persons on curfew orders. 18 persons were detained in St. Catherine North and 1 in St. Catherine South as a result of these operations. Operations have also been launched in St. Anne, St. Mary, and Westmoreland. Portmore St. Catherine has been identified as a likely area where displaced criminals may be housed. As such, a joint team from CTOC and the Fugitive Apprehension Team, Mobile Reserve, have conducted targeted raids on several premises. The Mobile Reserve and St. Catherine Central Police have picked up 2 persons of interest in Augustown this very morning relative to a shooting in the community last night. Continued operations by CTOC and the Fugitive Apprehension Team have resulted in the apprehension of 2 men wanted in the United States. Mr. Speaker, the regulations will be laid for the state of emergency will be laid shortly on the table of the House. However, Mr. Speaker, in light of this reality, this administration fully supports these regulations as gazetted. Beyond giving the security forces additional powers of search, detention, and seizure, a great part of these regulations is aimed at protecting and preserving public safety. I now highlight some of the major provisions of the regulations. An authorized person may arrest without warrant and detain pending inquiries any person whose behavior is of such a nature as to give reasonable grounds for suspecting that he has 1, acted or is acting in a manner prejudicial to the public safety, or 2, has committed, is committing, or is about to commit an offense against these regulations. It provides for the institution of curfews. Additionally, it provides for the closure of businesses at specified times. In this respect, we have also seen great compliance with the business sector in St. James, and we commend them for their support. It provides for the establishment of a tribunal to review cases of detention or restriction. The regulations also provide protection for members of the security forces in that no action, suit, or prosecution or other proceedings shall be brought or instituted against any member of the security forces in respect of any act done in good faith during this emergency period. For the purpose of this particular regulation, a certificate issued by the minister that any act of a member of the security forces was done in the exercise or purported exercise of his function, or for the public safety, or for the restoration of order, or the preservation of peace, or otherwise in the public interest, shall be sufficient evidence that such member was acting, and any such act shall be deemed to have been done in good faith unless the contrary is proven. It is important to take away that only acts done in good faith are afforded protection. Mr. Speaker, the state of emergency has been in effect for 6 days and has garnered support both locally and internationally. Regrettably, there has been 1 incident of shooting and murder. But apart from this incident, there has been no other report of any major crime being committed during the period or in this space. Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to report that so far there has been no reports of human rights abuse. However, the Legal Aid Council stand ready to provide representation for detainees. We urge the public to be responsible with their utterances and posts on social media, as we need to be conscious of protecting brand Jamaica. We want to commend the stakeholders in the tourism industry and encourage them to continue to promote Jamaica. We welcome the press to visit communities within this space. However, we encourage them to get in touch with the ground commanders, Lieutenant Colonel Sterling and ACP Elan Powell, before doing so. We again encourage all citizens to tell what they know. Mr. Speaker, we started the year with an incident, a well-publicized incident on the Palisades Strip, which represented an unfortunate series of events which must never reoccur. As a result, the country suffered reputational damage, and there were whispers of legal action against the country by some individuals and entities alike. Many have offered their opinion on the tone of a particular public statement that I had issued. Mr. Speaker, in retrospect, and after reviewing the press release and the totality of the circumstances, I have concluded that the whole matter could have been handled differently. Mr. Speaker, I note the recent concerns expressed in relation to ministerial interference in operational matters of the JCF, particularly following the Palisados matter. However, I must use this opportunity to point out that my sole reason for demanding answers on behalf of the public in that matter is to foster a culture of accountability within the security portfolio that I have the privilege of leading. Amid the chatter, the real lesson that must be learned is that people in position of responsibility must be held to account. The JCF is a command and control organization. Accountability is one of the standards of the force. The public expects it, and the rules governing the institution demands it. Sir, I have been accused of interfering in the distribution of motor cars for the JCF. I took, Mr. Speaker, to the office of the Commissioner a list of vehicles compiled by the ministry and asked if they could be accommodated. On that list were 5 vehicles for St. Elizabeth, which reflects requests of the members of Parliament there, Floyd Green, J.C. Hutchinson, Frank Witter, and Evan Redman. This list was compiled based on calls received from custodians, MPs, organizations, and citizens, including me. As a matter of fact, Mr. Speaker, the Member of Parliament from St. Andrew South West made a request in this very house, as well as Western St. Andrew, and they were on the list as well. You never write me. Mr. Speaker, in 2017, rape was down overall nationally. However, certain divisions showed increases. These were Trelawney, St. Mary, and Manchester. On my vehicle request list to the Commissioner were 3 cars for the Center for the Investigation of Sexual Offences and Child Abuse, ISOCA, in each of these parishes. The Commissioner felt that the car listed for St. Mary would be better used in Westmoreland in their policing program. I did not object. Mr. Speaker, if I was assigning cars, would I not assign one to the parish of my birth? Mr. Speaker, over the last couple of months, we have discovered a most disturbing trend of which you must be aware. We have been discovering altars to facilitate devil worship in many places where raids have been conducted by the security forces. This is a most dangerous trend, and the clergy is also disturbed by it. Mr. Speaker, the savagery, the brutality, and the horrific nature of some of these crimes point to sacrifices to these evil forces. Mr. Speaker, almost a year ago to this date, I made a flippant comment suggesting...
Order,
Mr.
please.
Speaker,
Order, please.
I want to assure my colleagues that I worship one God, the one and only true God that reigns, forgives, and sustains. Some people are playing with things, Mr. Speaker, they know nothing about, and open gates they cannot close. Mr. Speaker, we are closely monitoring another situation where juveniles are figuring prominently across Jamaica as either perpetrators or victims of crimes. According to data compiled by the police, 18 teenagers were arrested last year for shooting, 148 for illegal possession of firearm, and 63 for robbery with aggravation. Mr. Speaker, another challenge we face is the culture of silence that resides among some of us as leaders and citizens of this beloved country. We must pass information to the police. We must create and drive a wedge between us and the criminals. This moment we face as a nation demands a fundamental change, a break with the past. Good people can no longer remain silent. We must come together for Jamaica. We must become patriots, not informers. We must tell what we know. This administration has laid out an all-of-government approach to crime reduction. We have clearly articulated our roadmap in the 5-pillar crime reduction strategy, namely effective policing, swift and sure justice, reducing reoffending, situational prevention, and social development. Significant work is underway in support of effective policing strategy. A new Police Service Act is being drafted to replace the JCF Act. The e-policing project has already seen significant work done on a number of software solutions meant to support the operations of the security forces and boost intelligence-led policing. These include the Jamaica Eye, the QR Patrol Code, the JAMPOL Stat, and the Station Records Management System. Mr. Speaker, from an accountability perspective, I have to say that the legislative framework governing the national security architecture needs strengthening, as it is not sustainable in its current formation. Mr. Speaker, you cannot have a board that does not report to you as minister, nor can you name that board, but as minister, you are held responsible for its actions and the results of its actions. So it is with the Police Services Commission. The Police Services Commission is responsible for promotion, discipline, good order, and employing a commissioner of police. Yet the public holds the minister accountable for the outcomes of the security forces. Mr. Speaker, in 1993, Parliament amended the Jamaica Constabulary Force Act and gave full supervision of the force to the Commissioner. It was the right thing at the time. I am not advocating for it to be reversed, but it is my considered view that the people's representative must have a clearly defined role if he or she is to be properly held accountable by the citizens for the safety and security of the country. The police role is to serve, protect, and reassure. The people's representative also must have a role. Mr. Speaker, let me inform you that for the 20 years before 1993, when the change was made, the annual average murder rate in Jamaica was 22 per 100,000. Mr. Speaker, for the 20 years after the change, the average annual murder rate has jumped to 45 per 100,000. I am not suggesting that this is the only variable which explains the variance between 22 per 100 and 45 per 100. However, Mr. Speaker, it is clear that the policy change has not yielded the type of results that was expected back in 1993. Mr. Speaker, corruption in the police force remains a significant challenge. Let me hasten to say that the vast majority of the members of the force are law-abiding patriotic Jamaicans who work diligently in the service of their fellow citizens. But there is a minority that is corrupt or will not do their jobs competently and are not being held accountable to the extent that they ought to be. As we have seen time and time again, the actions of a corrupt few often cast a long shadow over the good work of the majority of the hard-working men and women of the force. Mr. Speaker, there is an inherent desire from citizens of the country to support the police in their efforts. That same citizenry, in addition to various civil society groups, having been very vocal in their call for the force to be rid of corrupt elements. As a government, we have been responsive to the demands made by the public and other groups. As such, last year, we provided a mechanism in the form of a revamped early retirement scheme for police officers that would help to achieve this objective. The new policy is with the Commissioner. He fully understands the issue of corruption and the overall impact that it has on the reputation of the organization, and has committed to begin the utilization of that important tool to hasten the transition of members of the force at all levels who are tainted by corruption or otherwise ineffective. The Ministry of National Security has identified funds necessary to underwrite these activities, and we are prepared to ask the Ministry of Finance for more if it is needed. Mr. Speaker, the criminal justice system is not yet at the level that we would wish to see it. The system needs significant strengthening. The system is overburdened and understaffed. Our judges, Mr. Speaker, are of the highest order caliber and standard. We truly and fully support Minister Chuck, who is leading reforms meant to overhaul the system. Mr. Speaker, we as legislators must quickly pass the relevant laws to ensure that although bail is a right, the circumstances under which it is dispensed must be clearly defined. When someone is released on bail and commits multiple serious crimes, including murder and shooting with intent, it points to the need for a re-examination of the system. It is my considered view that bail should not be considered in certain circumstances, for example, murder, gun crimes, drugs, lottery scamming, and extortion. We must be bold enough to pass legislation that will allow sentences to be appealed by the Director of Public Prosecution, as well as to have sentences run consecutively, not concurrently, for certain crimes. Mr. Speaker, we fully recognize that sustainable crime reduction requires improvement in our educational system. As such, we fully support Minister Reid in his efforts to transform the educational sector. The gradual removal of schools from the shift system, curriculum review, and the provision of additional school spaces are steps in the right direction. The government is moving towards completing the establishment of MOCA as an independent law enforcement entity. The MOCA bill that was worked on previously by the other administration has been laid by the Most Honourable Prime Minister and is scheduled for debate next Tuesday. Mr. Speaker, the Firearm Act is being reviewed and will be before Parliament within 3 months. The amended legislation will feature new penalties and harsher mandatory minimum sentences. This is the way to go, considering that the gun features in over 80% of all crimes in Jamaica. Mr. Speaker, in the near future, we will take to Parliament a bill to merge the Police Services Commission with the Police Civilian Oversight Authority. This was one of the recommendations arising from the strategic review of the constabulary force. We have set ourselves 6 months so to do. The revamped and realignment of these two institutions will establish a more robust oversight body which will help to drive accountability within the JCF. We intend to table within 6 months a Police Service Act which will replace the 150-year-old Jamaica Constabulary Force Act, which will subsequently be repealed. The goal is to break with the past and create a modern police service befitting of our times and to better protect the members and serve the public. The amendments to the Fingerprint Act will be completed and presented within 8 months. The Anti-Gang Act is being amended to allow for a watch list to be established, as well as the implementation of control orders against suspected criminals. We are also pursuing amendments to the Proceeds of Crime Act that will seek to have persons explain sudden wealth. These two pieces of legislation we are estimated should be ready within 10 months. Mr. Speaker, we are pursuing immediately a joint program against tax cheats who are suspected of funding criminal activities, and more information will follow on this matter. Mr. Speaker, I close by saying that the crime monster that confronts us did not start overnight. Neither can it be solved overnight. A murder does not start with the pointing of a gun and its firing. It started long before. It is preceded by the failure to get a good education, preceded by the failure to get a good moral grounding, reflecting respect for the sacredness of life. It's reflective of the selfishness and the evil that reside deep within the minds of some who lives amongst us. Mr. Speaker, be assured that fundamental and far-reaching changes are coming as we step up our efforts to secure this nation. The support, cooperation, and patience of all Jamaicans is needed. The issue of accountability can never be overemphasized. We welcome the very positive move of the opposition in agreeing for the ministry to give a crime update briefing to their local government representatives. We thank them for the cooperation and look forward to their help and assistance in other areas as we go forward in creating a safer and more prosperous Jamaica. Mr. Speaker, united as a people, we can overcome any challenge. As Jamaicans, more than ever, the time for unity is now. Let us put aside petty differences and work together in Jamaica's interests. Mr. Speaker, if it so pleases you.
Mr. Jackson.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. Mr. Speaker, I wish to start where the minister ended. And I quote, "The crime monster that confronts us did not start overnight. Neither can it be solved overnight." It is 2 years now since the government came into office, knowing very well what the crime monster was. In fact, much was said by no other than the Prime Minister as leader of the opposition then about what can be done by the government to deal with the crime and violence in the country. Those were the Prime Minister's words. So, Mr. Speaker, I find it a little bit challenging that after 2 years, we are hearing that it's a new discovery that we have a crime monster in Jamaica. In summary, Mr. Speaker, the minister indicated in the latter part of his presentation a readiness to do much of the preparatory work that was done before they took office. By extension, we can conclude that very little was done throughout the past 2 years leading to now, and it is most regrettable. Mr. Speaker, the matter of crime and violence is not an abstract, esoterical notion. It is one that affects the lives of every single Jamaican here and abroad. Not only about those who have been murdered, but the level of fear that every single Jamaican has to live with on a daily basis. So, Mr. Minister, we welcome the fact that the government is now prepared to move with much of the recommendations in the strategic reform, the strategic review of the JCF. Much of what you spoke about, Minister, was said long ago and nothing, absolutely nothing was done. Over 2 years. Now, to the state of emergency, Mr. Minister, the opposition has publicly indicated its support for the state of emergency. But, Mr. Minister, we did not arrive at this point overnight. 1,616 persons murdered last year, and within the first 20 days of this year, 100 persons have been murdered. It is regrettable that there's so many lives, such high level of fear that has brought the government to recognize that something must be done. We have been saying this for months. Treat the high crime areas in a different way. And so many lives have to be lost to get us at this point. Mr. Speaker, the state of emergency, as the minister said, is not a panacea. It is not going to solve the national crime challenge. I see indicated here a number of operational activities to be undertaken by the security forces, yet the Prime Minister told the nation that he had to wait this long to do what he has just done. In the other areas, something that we have literally been begging for. We have said, Mr. Speaker, and I repeat, establish a special task force for Kingston and St. Andrew and St. James, where we have the high levels of murders, and Clarendon or other designated areas. Focus your investigative resources in those areas. Do what you seem to be willing to do now. Why has it taken so long? And how much more lives we have to lose in Jamaica for the government to act in a firm and definitive way to deal with the crime challenge. My question, one of my questions to the Speaker, to the Minister, Mr. Speaker, what does the 5 pillars constitute the crime plan of the government to deal with the crime problem? I would like the Minister to definitively state that, because the opposition has stated clearly, we are willing to cooperate with the government, but we want to know around what we are cooperating. Because let me make it clear, Mr. Speaker, the opposition has no executive authority. It is only the government that has that authority. You have one government at a time. A crime plan cannot be developed in a notional way. It has to be data-driven. It has to be driven by research. And only the government has access to the breadth of information and data that is necessary. And for that reason, we say, present something that we can consider and work with you around. We are willing and ready, for Jamaica's sake, to put our bit on the table. But we want something to work with. We are not prepared.
Mr. Speaker, if I may, let me remind the Honourable Member that the 5-pillar crime reduction strategy was laid in the House and copies given to all the members of the House. And I undertake to present him with another copy.
Mr. Speaker, may I advise the Minister that I do have a copy, but my question was not whether we got one or not. My question was whether or not that constitutes the government's crime plan. If that is the sum total of the crime plan, that was a simple question. So yes, you need not give us another copy. We are a sum total. Every way it adds up. I take note, Minister, of the provisions for ensuring that the rights of the citizens in St. James is observed. I would like to know how adequate you believe the human resource provision in that regard is. And I also would like to know, Mr. Minister, if in light of the state of emergency in St. James, is it that Zozo has now been put on pause, and what is the operational relationship, if any, between Zozo and the state of emergency in that parish? A couple other items for which you made mention of, Mr. Minister. The interference of the Minister in the operational duty. The operational sphere of the constabulary force. Mr. Speaker, I wish to make it abundantly clear. The opposition will not support any effort to give ministerial authority to the Minister for any operational matters. Mr. Speaker, we must learn from our past. Mr. Speaker, I wish to make it clear. The Minister indicates what his intentions are. And I want the country to be aware that this opposition will resist it every day. Mr. Speaker, we must learn from the past. We have learned from the past. We have had the experience where the political interference in the operations of the JCF have caused undesirable results.
Mr. Jackson, are you stating that the minister has said that he intends to do that?
It's here.
Mr. Jackson, if Mr. Minister says so, will you quote it so nobody can disrupt you? The minister states that he intends to do that, then you quote it, and so nobody is permitted to disrupt you.
Mr. Speaker, I think I've made my point pretty much clear on that matter. If you want, I'll repeat it. Mr. Speaker, I heard the minister made reference to his reckless comment about Obia. Mr. Minister, the business of the national security and the lives of our people is not a joking matter. And I hope it will never happen again. But it's a bit late because it has seeped into people's psyche that that's what you're all about. But I warn you, Minister, it doesn't augur well. It doesn't augur well for us as a country. I'm not talking about the government, for us as a country. You are our Minister of National Security, not just for your party, but the entire country. So I welcome the public apology that you have made. Mr. Minister, regarding further to the ministerial interference, the representation for which you speak of, he referred to it. You must read the statement. Mr. Minister, you made reference to the representations that have been made to you. The information out there is somewhat different, right? Things are not necessarily what they may be, but also what they appear to be. And when persons make representation to you, it is not for you to give instruction on the operational side, but it's for you to extend the representation that is needed. Mr. Minister, again, what you do is not only symbolic, but it sends the wrong signal. For you as Minister of National Security to put on a stage someone charged for murder, to speak as an inspirational personality to our police men and women who have to go out there and challenge some of the worst criminals, does not help. This is the kind of carelessness, recklessness, and lack of proper sound judgment. Mr. Minister, you can't continue along that path and expect to earn the confidence, first and foremost, of the police force. They are the ones who have to confront the criminals on a day-to-day basis. You can't, the same one who they run down to catch is the one you use to inspire them. Something is wrong. So, Mr. Minister, I encourage you to desist from those kinds of reckless action. These are my comments for now, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Mr. Daly, you have a question for the minister? Mr. Daly has a question for the minister. Proceed, Mr. Daly.
Mr. Speaker, I listened to the minister's statement, and quite frankly, I'm sorry for the minister, The minister personally is a nice person. And I know the minister has a weight that he's carrying that he didn't like. He didn't want to be the Minister of National Security. And I can understand the difficulty you face each day. And I sincerely, as a man to a man, I sincerely understand how difficult it is for you each night when you go to bed, because the weight is on your head and on the Prime Minister's head. Because based on what pronouncements were made prior to the elections, it gave the impression that the fixing of this crime monster was an easy thing. Now you have come to realize what several administrations have realized. You didn't mention much about Clarendon in your statement, which is sad, because the three problem areas for crime coming out of the reports last year: St. James, number 1, Clarendon, number 2. And something different in the crime manifestation in the parish been taking place from last year, the beheadings. I'm not sure if you're aware, if the police have briefed you at your regular weekly meetings. 6 beheadings in the parish of Clarendon between last year, I think, and January. If you see something like this emerge, like kidnapping, I would have thought that there would have been a special squad put in place, calling for extra help, because this is, you used to talk about ISIS when you were in opposition. This is not ISIS operating in Clarendon, you know. It's a new type of crime. Body found in the Rio Minno, no head. Body found in Comfort, 2 bodies, no head. And it doesn't jerk you. It doesn't jerk the government.
Mr. Speaker.
I'm asking you. It doesn't trigger. This doesn't trigger a response from the administration for a special investigative unit to be put in place for what has happened in the parish of Clarendon?
Mr. Speaker.
If this don't jerk the government, what will jerk you?
Mr. Speaker.
I am telling you,
Mr. Speaker,
that you have multilateral entities in Jamaica that can help you. Calling the FBI to help you in Clarendon.
Mr. Daly, I disrespect the Speaker.
Calling the FBI, my friend, it is serious. And I don't know how this could pass and the government will say nothing about it.
Have a seat, please.
He's finished.
The Speaker is standing and I ask you to have a seat.
But you know that, you have to take the seat when the Speaker stands. I shall allow the Speaker to stand.
Mr. Daly, Mr. Daly, let us run this House in order and according to the standing orders. You were to ask a question.
Mr. Speaker,
I'm speaking,
if the
Mr. Daly,
beheadings in Clarendon is not of concern to the administration,
you, Mr. Daly.
6 people have been beheaded. And you have said nothing about it. It is serious, Minister. It is serious.
Minister.
Let me rise on a point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Henry.
Because I heard my colleague from Clarendon appealing on behalf of Clarendon. It's a pity he didn't call me equally as a member of Parliament to join me in my call, which I made for this matter to be addressed. The point of order is you didn't hear because maybe you don't listen. But the reality is it's a collective responsibility. It is not a blame game. And I would hope you will recognize that all of these matters are being addressed in the crime plan.
Minister, next statement.
Attention earlier, the issue of statement by ministers. A statement by minister does not require a speech by anybody else. The standing order provides for questions for clarity. And the grandstanding does not help. And it saddens me that we are starting the new year in this form of indiscipline. I know it far more than you, Mr. Bunting, so don't let me read standing order. Mr. Speaker, I do hope that Mr. Speaker, on a point of order, we'll adhere to the standing order.
The acting House Leader is violating the standing orders by calling me by my name.
And I'm
raising that as a point of order.
And we cannot continue like this in this new year. We need to set some example and start the grandstanding.
Mr. Speaker, I need to show a point of order.
Both of us come on our feet, and this type of disrespect. This type of disrespect must stop.
Orders.
Mr. Bunting, you are away for the Christmas season. And I would believe that we read Mr. Twait over the Christmas season. A member of this House presentation on behalf of the rest of us. I'm appealing to you to recognize not only that the media is here, but we are being watched by the world.
And
our standard must represent what one of our members are hoping that we can have here. I'm not going to fail you. I'm going to follow the standing orders fairly and firm.
You don't do that.
Statements by Minister.
If you allow me, Mr.
No, we have questions.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I have a question that I'd like to put to the Minister.
Mrs. Burke, you have a question for the Minister on the previous statement?
Yes, I do.
Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Mr. Minister, I listened very carefully to the statement that you gave, and I was wondering, because as I listened, and I know you could not have included everything in the statement, but my question really has to do with the importance of street lights and the absence of street lights across our communities, and the kind of fear that is engendered, and the fact that there are many women and children going to school, getting up early, it creates a problem, co-curricular activities on jobs with shifts. And my concern, Minister, as I ask the question, is that it's bad enough when citizens might feel that it is okay to just put up a street light where they need it. My real fear, and I'm asking you, Minister, I would not like to see anyone else in authority just put up a street light because they think it is necessary. Because certainly those of us in this House, I know, would never be involved in that kind of activity. And we would want to ensure that we set a good example. Thank you.
Statement by Minister. Mr. Chuck. Mr. Chuck. Mr. Chuck.
Mr. Speaker, there are some questions that have been posed to the Minister, and I think he wants to answer.
Mr. Speaker.
Minister Montague.
Mr. Speaker,
I have been advised
I would like to answer,
that
sir,
you are
if I'm
prepared
allowed.
to answer some questions that have been asked of you. Will you proceed to do so?
Mr. Speaker, the member spoke to Zozo. The Zozo law still remains in effect. With regards to certain operational matters, the very thing I spoke to the member from Clarendon, while I too feel your pain and understand how dejected you are in seeing the 6 beheadings. It has been brought to the attention forcefully by the very act itself to the police. And I know that the police is responding operationally. And the government, from a policy level, and has engaged international entities in an effort to garner the necessary resources that is required and which I spoke to in my statement. With regards to street lighting, Madam, I hear your plea. I would like to join you in that because I represent communities without street lights. And the lack of street lighting, of course, goes to safety in a community. And I don't think nobody is against that. And I also join you in your plea that we ought not, as much as the need is there, we ought not to be engaging in illegal activities. With regards to the support for the state of emergency, the government again welcomes the support of the opposition. And we stand ready, we are available, and again, I thank the opposition for making their local government representatives available for a briefing, and we are grateful for the support that you have pledged.
Mr. Chuck.
And to the leaders of the House. Okay? Go ahead. Mr. Speaker, this Honourable House is reminded of the recommendations of the West Kingston Commission of Inquiry in its report published in September 19, 2016, that citizens who suffered loss and damage to property and business during the May 2010 events in West Kingston, the West Kingston incursion, should be compensated. Mr. Speaker, on November the 21st, 2016, Cabinet approved the establishment of a compensation committee with the responsibility of reviewing the claims of persons affected by the West Kingston incident. At the time, Mr. Speaker, the compensation committee was set up, over 150 claims were reported to the public defender. It was clear from the outset that this was not an exhaustive list of the persons who suffered during the incident. Rather, they related to persons of whom evidence was adduced at the inquiry. The House is asked to note the fact, Mr. Speaker, that the members of the public were duly informed of the process of making a claim by the Ministry of Justice through the issuing of flyers in the affected communities and publications in the media. Mr. Speaker, the deadline for the submission of all claims to the committee was set for December the 2nd, 2016. However, at the request of the public defender, it was extended to December the 5th, 2016. Mr. Speaker, despite the extensive publications, some persons disregarded the deadlines and the process for filing applications. Mr. Speaker, on September the 7th, 2017, the public defender informed that some 400 additional claims existed which have not been investigated by her office. This information, Mr. Speaker, was provided when the Compensation Committee was in the process of preparing its report. It is important to note, Mr. Speaker, and for the House to be reminded that the committee's deadline for the submission of all claims was December the 5th, 2016. Mr. Speaker, the recommendations for compensation for death and personal injury were made in keeping with what a court in Jamaica would have awarded. The overall recommendation from the Compensation Committee is $199,141,435.69 to cover all claims, fatal, personal injury, and property damage. A total of 447 recommendations, Mr. Speaker, were made by the Compensation Committee for monetary compensations. As of January 12, 2018,
the Ministry of Justice has paid a total sum of $178,381,835.69 to some 270 claimants directly and a further 29 to the Administrator General. As such, the balance of $21,618,164.31 is to be paid to the remaining 148 claimants. These 148 claimants, Mr. Speaker, must come forward and provide their banking information promptly, as any amount not disbursed at the end of March 2018, will revert to the Consolidated Fund. The Ministry, Mr. Speaker, intends to act in strict compliance with the recommendations of the Compensation Committee. As such, the Ministry will not be going beyond the recommendations set out in the report. Mr. Speaker, the government has done all it can in keeping with the recommendations and with due process to offer compensation to persons who would have been affected by the unfortunate May 2010 events in West Kingston. The Compensation Committee consisted of persons of the highest integrity, chaired by retired President of the Court of Appeal, Honourable Mr. Justice Seymour Panton, Reverend Renard White, and Reverend Harold Blair Jr. They sat and heard and considered applications for 9 months. Persons applied on their own, through their attorneys, and through the Office of the Public Defender. The matter of compensation is now closed. Let me re-emphasize that the Compensation Committee met for 9 months, and many persons who are now seeking compensation made no attempt to apply or bring their case to the committee. The issue of any further compensation cannot now be reopened. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister made the apology to the Tivoli Committee late last year. We would like to put this most unfortunate incident of May 2010 behind us. Mr. Speaker, may I add that Cabinet responded promptly not only to make the payments recommended by the Compensation Committee, but during my tenure has responded promptly to the payment of judgment debts. Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to report that as of January the 23rd, 2018, the Ministry of Justice has paid out 99% of the principal sums awarded and referred to the Ministry of Justice up to November 2017. Which means, Mr. Speaker, for the first time in judgment debts, we are almost up to date, 99% up to November 2017. Only 4 large amounts remain for which interim payments are being made. Mr. Speaker, during the fiscal year, the Ministry of Finance provided the Ministry of Justice with a total of $849 million, of which $705 million has already been paid. A balance of approximately $144 million remains on account to pay judgment debts that have been awarded or settled and sent over to the Ministry of Justice. The delay in completing these payments is due to lack of banking details, trustee information, and the original form and orders being required on the files. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Ministry of Finance for providing the funds and the hard-working Accounts Department of the Ministry of Justice, whose members worked assiduously over the past 4 weeks to make the hundreds of payments to the Tivoli Compensation as recommended by the Tivoli Compensation Committee, as well as for outstanding judgment debts. The Ministry of Justice, Mr. Speaker, is working very hard.
Mr. Tweed.
Mr. Speaker, I've been asked to respond to the Minister. Could the Minister indicate the total sums paid to the aggrieved parties of the Tivoli incursion from 2010 up to now? The common knowledge is that significant sums were disbursed before the Compensation Committee, and the public have a right to know, as I am sure the Minister will agree, how much is the sum that the taxpayer has had to expend in respect of this incident. Secondly, I would ask the Minister, what changes does the government envisage in the architecture of political culture and security arrangements which would prevent an event such as this, which has been so costly, the least of the costs being in money, prevent this from happening again? Thirdly, I'd ask the Minister what recommendations of the David Simmons Commission of Inquiry, if any, are outstanding for the government to comply. And Mr. Speaker, having asked those questions, I state again that while compensation has been paid, there is a moral debt that remains unpaid, and without it, this matter cannot be put to rest. Who was responsible for what took place in 2010 that defaced the nation and shed its blood? The Commission of Inquiry spoke about the area concerned as being the place of a surrogate government, of a state within a state. In this Honourable House, places were, in this Honourable House, defense was made of that situation. And what we have done here is merely the most obvious manifestation of an infectious carbuncle of corrupt behavior that has damaged Jamaica. And unless it is acknowledged, those who presided over it, who spoke about it, yes, we cannot put this matter behind us. Government needs to tell us what arrangements are being made so that this can never happen again. If we give reparation, reparation must always succeed confession. There has been none in this regard.
Let me respond first.
Minister, you may Minister Chuck, you may choose to reply individually.
No, let me just respond.
Or you may
record
them and do one presentation. But I would suggest that since you are standing, you proceed to reply to the member from Central Kingston.
Yes. Mr. Speaker, the member will recall that it was laid in the House, to the best of my recollection, in the previous Parliament, the amount that was spent by the Ministry of Social Security immediately after the incursion. I don't have the figure now, member, but my recollection is somewhere in the region of 180 million was paid directly to persons. I don't remember the figures, but I know after the incursion, the Ministry of Social Security paid out monies. What I can tell the member is that in the report itself, the Compensation Committee noted that persons who were paid, their claims were rejected because it was, they compiled and did a matrix of what was paid by the Social Security Ministry. And so those persons who claimed again, their claims were rejected. Okay? So all of those. So once the Ministry of Social Security had claims that were made by particular claimants, the Compensation Committee was able to put those aside, and those were rejected. About half of the claims were rejected. So, and to the best of my knowledge, a lot of the money was for additional security in the community immediately after the incursion. Member, may I just say that this government is doing everything in its power to ensure that what took place in May 2010 never happened again. Indeed, member, in the ZOSA legislation and in the state of emergency just recently called, we emphasized to the security forces that the protection, upholding, and promotion of human rights were to be top priority. And we have seen that in Mount Salem and in Denham Town, and in the state of emergency just called, all the citizens of St. James attest to the good public relations, the respect for human rights. So in that regard, member, I can say that this government will ensure as best as possible that what happened in May 2010 never again occurred. On the third point, member, you will recall that the Prime Minister and I reported in the last Parliament the number of all the recommendations of the David Simmons inquiry. We updated Parliament on all the recommendations that were complied with. And that is, as far as I know, member, that was done in the last Parliament.
Mr. Speaker, Minister, that attempt at an accounting, I think...
Mr. Hilton.
The attempt at accounting, I think, is appropriate, entirely appropriate. What I want to ask, Minister, is whether in this attempt at accounting and putting it behind us, if there is any accounting for the damage to public facility, apart from the compensation, which is me, that there were damages to public facilities. I recall stations attacked and burnt and other public facility. Is there a sum that is accounted for in that? Because I think in the history that I think that full accounting is warranted.
Yeah. Thanks for that question, member. In the budget, we supplied 220 million, of which just under 200 million was for the direct compensation. 20 million plus additional sums to be obtained from other sources will be to repair damages to public property, including various parts, Tivoli itself, where pockmarks still remain. We would like to remove all the pockmarks and perhaps fix back up the community center and additional areas so that we can really put this incident behind us. So I thank you for that question. The answer is yes.
Mr. Shimido.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in 2017, we had in the Ministry of Agriculture a most challenging but exciting year for the sector. Following a 13.5% growth in the sector in 2016, we were greeted in early 2017 by a persistent drought, resulting in a 3.7% decline in the first quarter. Of course, as we well know, from April to the end of the year, we have had almost continuous rains with flooding events in May and June. The continuous nature of the rains resulted in second and third quarter declines. Preliminary estimates indicate that we will have a decrease for this sector of about 4%. From June to October alone last year, direct crop and livestock losses amounted to over $300 million. Mr. Speaker, the weather conditions not only caused losses in crops and livestock, but its continuous nature inhibited efforts at resolution, such as plowing and land preparation and planting of certain crops. At the same time, the weather significantly impacted the latter part of the sugarcane harvest and mitigated against indicators of factory efficiency and the quality of the cane. Mr. Speaker, as if the weather was not enough, we have also had a battle with the impact of pests and diseases especially in the area of the beet armyworm outbreak and the cocoa frosty spot disease, which has now spread from Clarendon to cover almost all of St. Mary and parts of St. Catherine. Given the profile of our sector, agriculture is indeed risky business. This sector is dominated by a myriad of small players with small plots of land operating at the subsistence level. And without insurance. A responsible government, therefore, has to respond to some of these assistance. The ministry has so far provided $240 million in support to the Rural Agricultural Development Authority to provide planting material and other inputs to farmers. In the case of the beet armyworm, we provided $18 million to provide support to farmers affected in St. Elizabeth. Cabinet only last week approved a $700 million program to fight the frosty spot disease over the next 2 years. Unfortunately, the inclement weather continued into 2018, and we have so far witnessed extensive flooding in Portland, St. Mary, and Trelawney, not only causing agricultural damage to the tune of over $343 million, but significantly infrastructure damage such as farm roads and other factors which provide some $100 million in support for these parishes that will be necessary. Mr. Speaker, these events in the agricultural sector have focused our attention to explore a new strategy for agricultural development. The growth and development of this sector has always been closely correlated with the weather. The onset of climate change has made this correlation even closer, and the sector cannot continue to perform at a sustainable manner unless we radically shift our strategy. Mr. Speaker, while irrigation provides a level of mitigation against drought, it does not ameliorate conditions of flooding. The efforts of the government to expand irrigation is not only admirable but critical. The course we are starting with the development in Essex Valley, there will also be initiatives afoot to significantly improve irrigation in southern St. Catherine and Clarendon, which has the largest tracts of flat, contiguous, fertile agricultural land. In this initiative, we must accord priority to the rehabilitating of irrigation infrastructure that serves the sugar industry. This must be done by concreting earthen canals, rehabilitating wells, and converting flood systems to pressurized systems to facilitate drip irrigation. It is important to secure a minimum of 7,500 hectares of sugarcane to ensure the viability of the Monimus factory. Beyond that, there are abundant lands suitable for other high-value crops. Mr. Speaker, given the inability of irrigation to deal with flooding events and excessive rains, which are poised to become more frequent with climate change, we must now focus our attention on the rapid expansion of protected agriculture, that is greenhouse agriculture, hydroponics, etc. At the same time, we have to simultaneously address some of the structural issues such as farm roads. And Mr. Speaker, in this regard, by the end of the financial year, we will spend in excess of $366 million. A substantial farm road program will be, in our view, a permanent feature of the ministry going forward. But Mr. Speaker, as I am on the question of farm roads, we are providing this year, by the end of the financial year, for a provision of $366 million that I mentioned, which will involve some 65 farm roads. That covers at least one in every constituency affected. In addition, we provide assistance by way of productivity incentives. And you recall when I addressed the House last year, and I mentioned that we were embarking on a program for the distribution of productivity incentive resources, that we will be channeling the vast majority of these funds through the office of each member of Parliament throughout the country. That was done, and I am to report that there are at the moment a total of $39.4 million that is so far unspent. Broken down as follows. There are 48 constituencies with balances. 17 of those constituencies are under 100,000. 4 are over 250,000. 15 have no balances at all, and I might pause to indicate here that in the parish of Manchester, none of the constituencies have any balances left on the amount allocated. Under 1 million, there are 9 constituencies that fall into that category. And over 1 million unspent, there are 18 constituencies that have not so far spent the funds allocated to them to the tune of a balance of $1 million outstanding. It is therefore our intention to communicate with these members of Parliament who have failed to exercise their responsibilities under the program. There are 2 constituencies in particular. One where there is over $6 million untouched, and another of $3.6 million untouched. Those constituencies, of course, will know that in a very short while, if these funds are not spent, they will be reallocated. And we will certainly reallocate them on the basis of those constituencies that have displayed not only a willingness but an ability to utilize the funds in the interest of the small farmers. We are focusing in the ministry on supporting new agricultural development through encouraging large players to enter agriculture. And in this regard, we believe that lands that are now available, that were once in cane, especially in the Bernard Lodge area, will be offered to large players who can have protected agriculture, that is greenhouses, extensively. And we are in discussions with 2 business groups that are interested in developing a total of 1,500 acres. And we are hoping that through the development of onions in particular that will carry us a far way in being self-sufficient in onions. Mr. Speaker, we are quite certain that with the concept or the reintroduction in a serious manner in the concept of the mother farm strategy, that we will be able to extend agriculture and return to a state of continuous growth, God willing, with better weather. Thank you very much.
Dr. Ferguson.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Minister for his presentation. However, from all indications, while we would have had an excellent year in 2016, 13.5% growth, we had agriculture contributing 7.3% to GDP, 16.6% in relation to employment. The fact is, Mr. Speaker, that 2017 could not have been described, as the Minister did, as being an exciting year, challenging but exciting. The fact is, Mr. Speaker, that in the first quarter of 2017, agricultural growth decreased by 3.7% as a result of drought. Between April and December, 3 continuous quarters of drought based on rainfall. It is therefore strange, Mr. Speaker, that the ministry could be projecting that for 2017 agriculture growth be in the region of 9.5%. You said 4% loss over 2016, and you had a 13.5% growth in the sector in 2016. Well, you can explain that. But whatever it is, Mr. Speaker, the fact is that I do believe that when the final figures are brought forward, agriculture would have had a worse year than what is being projected now relative to growth. And I understand, Mr. Speaker, that that would have implication also for the growth agenda. The minister spoke to the fact that between June and October, we lost $300 million between June and October. You spoke to 2016, in January alone, that you would have lost $343 million again in the sector. You spoke to the fact that for the loss in 2017, the ministry, through RADA, provided $240 million through productive incentives. And for the loss in January of 343, you have provided $100 million to the affected parishes. I noted in your presentation, Honourable Minister, that you said the parishes affected would have been Portland, St. Mary, and Trelawney. But St. Thomas was badly affected in January also. So I make an appeal, although parochial, as it relates to the farmers in St. Thomas. I appreciate the fact that the ministry and minister has come to the position that we can no longer, based on drought, based on pests and diseases, we can no longer depend on rainfall agriculture. And to that extent, you are now looking at protective agriculture going forward that will bring the greenhouses and the hydroponics, etc. What I am suggesting, Mr. Speaker, is that as we go forward, I think it is going to be important outside of the irrigation systems that is being considered for drought period, the question of research and development must be taken more seriously relative to an expansion of the spending for research and development to deal with pests and diseases. Because again, if we fail so to do, in the case of cocoa, the Fusty pod disease has impacted significantly, and I note that the cabinet has approved $700 million over a 2-year period. But I also believe that significant part of that funding should go towards research and development, because that will make a major difference relative to the prevention of these diseases and early control of these diseases. You touched on farm roads, again, Mr. Speaker, and you mentioned that $366 million will be spent between now and the end of the financial year. I just need to know whether there is any major consideration for farm roads going into the 2017-18 financial year. I want to say, Honourable Minister, the 18-19, whether there will be a major farm road program. And I just want to say, although we are focused on some areas, there are some other crops that are badly impacted by the recent rainfalls, coffee and others, that we really need to take a close look, because these farmers are really under significant pressure based on the cost of coffee now, what they are getting, and what is happening relative to cocoa. So, Honourable Minister, I think the opposition, at least we are pleased that there are some responses that have come. We are pleased that you are looking now at the protective agriculture as a policy going forward. And what we are now saying, that we want to be assured that when we have these floods, excessive rainfalls, that the right persons, the right farmers, the affected farmers are the ones getting the benefits. I therefore look forward, Minister, to seeing the outcomes of your final findings from RADA relative to the damage over the last period.
Mr. Mudo.
Honourable Member, let me start at the end, and I thank you for your observations. The fact of the matter is that one of the key strategies is to have a system that focuses primarily on the most affected. And any productivity incentive that we offer is geared to assisting the farmers, the genuine farming community of the country. And that is why I implore all members of Parliament to whom funds are allocated to ensure that their allocations are done in a very responsible manner and that they focus on farming communities within their constituencies. The structure of the distribution of productivity incentive assistance can come in four forms really. It can be through the JAS, it can be through the PMO, it can be through RADA, and it can be through persons independent of all of those who go into RADA and make an independent appeal, and rather assesses them and assists them in that way. So RADA has funds that will be available or has been available to them. Huh? No, the MPs get an allocation, and that is taken from the productivity incentive budget. And it is your responsibility to ensure that you utilize any of the structures existing, either through the JAS, there's no prohibition on that, or the PMO system, or through any group of legitimate farmers in your constituency who are prepared to be registered with RADA to undertake any project that is approved by RADA, who will investigate to ensure that the funds are spent in a transparent and legitimate fashion. That is the only caveat to the development at the local level, that is the constituency level, where the members of parliament ought to be in direct contact with the farmers in their constituencies. So there's no restriction as far as that is concerned. With respect to the coffee situation, we have had a devastating downturn in the market price of coffee from Japan, our main market for Blue Mountain coffee. Only recently I spoke with the head of the new Coffee Association and president of JS, who indicated to me that the last appeal made was a negative appeal where the large companies that buy from us bluntly refuse to purchase beyond a certain level. Refuse. We are therefore left with few options, but the one that is the most constructive is to go in search of new markets and to package coffee with modern designs. And I'm so pleased to see the Mountain Peak brand labeled Jamaican Mountain Peak coffee in little packets already mixed. So you buy it, you tear it, you pour it in, put water, and you have ready coffee. That is the kind of creative approach that is going to drive the industry forward. In addition to working with the tourism sector through the Linkages Council to expand the use of our local coffee in the hotel system. It is out of a need to utilize what is grown locally that I introduced a provision whereby no coffee can be processed for sale in Jamaica that does not have at least 20% of locally grown coffee in the pack. So that if it is that we need, as indeed we do now, because high mountain coffee is not at the level that is sufficient to satisfy the need of the market, and you have to import green beans, it cannot be as was in the case before, where you package 100% imported green beans from, say, for instance, a Central America or Latin American country. We know you have to show where 20% at least includes locally grown coffee. In that way, we are creating a demand for coffee locally grown, and we encourage farmers and investors to now go into the production expansion of the growing of high mountain coffee. the farm road program. This year, we are on a very tight budget because the Prime Minister, through the Ministry of Finance, I went and appealed to them for some money to deal with farm roads, cane roads, and other roads in agriculture. No, these are funds allocated through the Ministry of Finance. Yes, consolidated support for agriculture. And what we have gotten is 320 million in total, of which a portion goes to cane roads and the rest goes to other farm roads. It's a great challenge for us to spend this money between now and the end of the financial year. I believe that we are capable of doing that because already, fortunately, we saw where there's a flood that damaged so much in Portland.
Emergency procurement.
Emergency procurement.
Emergency procurement.
Emergency procurement.
Absolutely.
No, but no. Well, no, we don't have to use emergency procurement. We can simply postpone it until next year and go through a tender process if you wish. I have no problem.
My partial emergency.
I want to get it done early, but if you feel that it's objectionable, then we have no problem. All right. So we are making an effort to get it done. And as I indicated to you, we have allocated it wide and far, and in fact, member, I am prepared at the next sitting of the House to table the names of all the constituencies and the amount allocated based on the estimates that have been undertaken. And it is our intention also that the funds allocated to us this year will be put in RADA, which will preserve it for next year. So we'll have a continuous repair program, not stop and start, where at the end of the year you stop and wait for another budget. But it will be continuous. So the idea is we won't have any pause for several months as we repair the roads, especially outside of the rainy period, so that we can get done. Well, we are supposed to be outside of the rainy period now, because for those of us in agriculture, we know that rain ought not to be falling much between January and the end of March. But the whole thing changed now. And the folks at Frome has advised me that the rain that is falling now for those in Westmoreland, the rains falling now at Frome is greater than during the rainy season. So everything has been turned upside down. But we have to cope with it. We can't throw up our hands. And I know in the final analysis, if everything goes wrong, the easiest name to call is the Minister of Agriculture. So I am trying my best to control weather as well as everything else. On the question of research, member, your point about research is absolutely critical. You don't have to repeat that. It's something that preoccupies our minds. And we have a very, as you know, we have an efficient staff that deals with this kind of thing, and disease eradication and all that. And the frosty pod disease at first was thought to be something that we could manage and contain. But because action wasn't sufficient at the time because of the we calculated it correctly, but the action that should have followed, the decision to cut back and so on, was not appropriately handled. And so we have had now to be more radical in our cutback program and our isolation of certain parishes and farms within those parishes. Fortunately, my colleague to the left is lucky. He's gotten away with it. Portland is not infected, and neither is St. Thomas, as you know. So we are hoping to isolate those parishes while we tackle Clarendon and St. Mary, which are now almost totally infected, which cannot be restored for at least another 2 years. So it's a challenge, and it's one that we are up to. We are trying our best. And finally, Minister, no, we did not anticipate a growth of 9% at all this year. In fact, quite the contrary. we anticipate a decline in growth for agriculture this year because of all the conditions. And it's always challenging. We're at the end of the year. We haven't got the final figures in yet. But it will be below 5%, but it certainly will not be a positive growth, regrettably. But agriculture is like that. It will bounce back as soon as the weather is better and the farmers get out there. They are very resilient, very creative and productive. And as soon as they get back out into the field, we will see an improvement. And I'm hoping that the improvement will be dramatic with our assistance to the farmer and community of Jamaica. Thank you very much.
Mr. Speaker, I just have a couple of points I wanted to clarify first.
Go ahead.
Okay. We too sympathize, Mr. Speaker, with the farmers. But Mr. Honourable Minister, as it relates to the frosty pod, and as you quite rightly said, the proper way, given where we are now, is containment. And I know that there are those eradication squads that are out there removing the pods, because one of the things they have to do is they have to remove those pods and you also have to destroy them. I'm going to urge you to take a look at the retention time between when the pods are removed and when they're actually cleared up from in the field. I think you may have some issues there. As it relates to the beet armyworm, we have lost in the first outbreak 40% of the crop, and this affected 50% of the farmers over there on the border of Manchester and St. Elizabeth. Your research, I'm sure, would have highlighted that a part of this problem was due to a glut and a reduction in the price that created an excessive amount of escallion in the field. So the first year, they got a very good price and everybody planted. And in the second year when they planted, there was no market. And it became more economical for them to just leave the crop in the field than to harvest it. My question is, in controlling this beet armyworm, have the ministry now formulated a method to sort of bring some balance to the whole marketing and linking the crop cycle to the levels of production that the farmers can produce? And the second part is, have you paid attention to the extension? Now, the extension officers may be out there, but the shortage of pheromone traps and the particular way in which the farmers are using them, I would want to know if you are doing some work there in terms of the integrated pest management approach. On the issue of sugar and lands, Mr. Minister, the average yield for the farmers in Monimusk last year was 41 tons cane per hectare. Based on the fact that they supplied just over 175,000 tons of cane, that would roughly calculate to about 4,200 hectares being harvested from. That's almost all the way up to your 7,500 that you are projecting to be made available. Could you tell the House and the farmers who are listening what is the projection, the yield projection? You are now at 45, because I would want to think that we have a productivity issue rather than an availability of land issue. And is there anything in place to address that? My fourth point, Mr. Minister, is that the reciprocal of flooding is drainage. And the stopgap or the mitigation strategy for drought is water harvesting. Could you say if from the recent rains we have had was anything harvested? What is the capacity of our water harvesting dams or ponds that we have in Jamaica? Are they now full? And is your irrigation plan geared towards the redistribution of this water, or is it that this money will be pumped into pulling water from underground that we have recently had? Because in every disaster you can get an opportunity. I think with this heavy rain that we're having, as you mentioned about the productive areas of the Southern Plains being our highest area of production, is there any plans by the ministry to ensure that whenever or if this does not stop, then we are harvesting the water. I see your focus very largely on irrigation, which, you know, an agronomist would look at it and say, irrigation where we're having so much flood. So I urge the ministry to lead the ministry on a path of harvesting some of this water in strategic areas by check dams and artificial dams so that we can redistribute this water. It'll be less expensive than the system you are proposing of drip irrigation, which is more efficient, I might add, but it's very expensive, and then the opportunity cost of doing it we have to consider. I'm not sure, I'm confident that my constituency is not one of the ones that is not spending, and not necessarily in defense of my colleagues here, but just to ask that you consider, as you would have stated in the second paragraph of your presentation, that when you're having this unprecedented amount of rainfall, you don't spend money quickly in agriculture. And so you probably could consider, if before you make that presentation to justify why the money is not spent, did you consider the fact that this unprecedented rainfalls that we've been having since April could have been a deterrent to the MPs? I know definitely the MPs in Portland and the MPs in St. Thomas and the MPs in St. Mary would not be spending that productivity incentive as fast as the MPs on the other side of the island. So I want you to consider that when you're making the report in a very objective way, so as not to, you know, highlight or impugn my fellow colleagues. And the final point and question, Mr. Minister, is we already know what the first, second, and third quarter growth for domestic food crop is. 4.3, well, you've said 3, 11% in the second quarter, and 2.8% in the third quarter. And we are awaiting the fourth quarter numbers for domestic food crop production. These new allocations that you are now making / announcing, how will it impact going forward on the strategies that you want to employ to restore the productive sector, particularly agriculture, for the upcoming year and during this very difficult period that we are having? Thank you very much.
Minister.
Mr. Hilton.
Minister, following on my colleague's question to you, to what extent the challenges within RADA itself might have been a constraint on the ability to spend the funds. And there I mean, while all of my funds are allocated, they were not necessarily spent because RADA could not field the amount of persons to do the due diligence that was required. And I'm also being advised that in some instances there are personal changes within RADA that may have resulted in some of the funds not being spent. So could you, if you can determine what extent some of the problems, apart from the rainfall, that may have contributed to some of the unspent funds in the instances where they have occurred?
Mr. Speaker, a question to the Honourable Minister. As it relates to the farm roads, is it not the purpose of the Member of Parliament to work with RADA in selection of these roads, or is it left to external influences coming in and selecting these roads and working with RADA and undermining the competence of the Member of Parliament?
So, Speaker, just two quick questions. Minister, the sugar farmers are still owed part of the sugar payment. It has been recently classified as molasses payment. Can you say when this payment will be made to farmers? The second question I want to ask you. There are a number of micro dams built by the Cubans and a number of them in Clarendon. Are you looking at activating them or utilizing them as part of your irrigation system?
I hope I do. All right. First of all, to put things in context, former minister and now member from Western St. Andrew, the unspent allocation in your account is 2 million, 1.97. And in the case of my friend from Northern Trelawney, who I don't know, you really didn't have to get nervous about it, member. Yours is only $782,000. But I know that by the time next month shall have passed, you will all spend the money. Because if you don't spend it, it's going to be reallocated. And we're going to reallocate it by the 15th. By the 15th of next month, if we do not see these funds moving in the direction that they were intended, we're going to reallocate it to the more active constituencies.
No, to the flood.
And to the flood. Can you wait, member from Portland, Eastern?
How much is that, Portland?
No, you said the reason why you didn't spend. I'm coming to that. I just want to put things in context. All right, now, you are referring to a change that took place in the management of the St. Andrew RADA offices, where the person that was there was the former Minister of Labour is the beneficiary of that person because they were transferred to St. Thomas, and that is something done as a matter of course. Well, it is always the same question, maybe asked of the Minister of National Security or anybody else. That is a management decision. That's not a political decision. So that was the only, but that would not have affected the allocation and the spending of your allocation. So if you put together your projects and submit them, if you do that, then you have no doubt at all that they will be done, and I will see to it. Well, not me, but Minister Hutchinson, who is responsible for RADA, will see to it that the projects are assessed and expedited. So you need not worry. On the question of allocation of roads, roads are allocated through dialogue. And to my knowledge, it might not be in every case, because there are a lot of roads and there are a lot of people. It might not be the case in every instance, but there are members that I look at here now that will attest to the fact that our representative goes and has dialogue with them on the priority roads based on their assessment combined, then the roads are listed. They are not arbitrarily chosen. And if anyone feels that a road that is allocated is not as much of a priority as they would like for purposes of assisting agriculture, then we are quite willing to look at it and see where it is where the funds can be best utilized. We have had a situation in sections of Westmoreland where the Member of Parliament did not like the location and was insisting on a certain location, and there were their request was acceded to. And, you know, we don't have any members of Parliament in Westmoreland. So it is not on the basis of politics, it's on the basis of what's best for agriculture. The molasses payment, member, will be out on Friday. I'm advised that it should have been paid already. And I realize that. And the farmers will get the payment for molasses this Friday. I checked on that. We had a meeting only today. The microdams, it's a concept that is extremely useful, and it is a focus of the WFO. The WFO is focusing on water harvesting, and it's easy for us to engage in that strategy as we embarked on it many years ago, but it seemed to have just, you know, like so many things. We try it, we don't get instant success with it or what have you, and we give it up. But it is something that will attract our attention. It's a very important element of agricultural development if we are to preserve the water that from rainfall without having to spend money to pump water through the wells. Of course, as you admitted, the use of drip irrigation is the most effective. But the idea is to convert open canal draining, especially in the sugar belt, which is really a waste. But if we can put that under pressure and pump it through drip irrigation, then it is the most productive way but at times more expensive because it takes a little more cost to make the infrastructural provisions. But we are certainly hoping that we will go a far way in getting the funds to engage that process. On the question of the amount of lands that are in cane at the moment, we are expecting no less. We have a commitment to Pan Caribbean to produce no less than 15 tons of sugar. We don't have any doubt. Member, you're blocking my. We have no doubt that we will achieve that quite comfortably. We are now growing up, we are now producing on some 3,500 hectares. We actually need 7,500 to be viable for the factory to be viable, at least 7,075. So we have to increase the development of cane lands at Monimus. And that is one of the objectives we have, to encourage investors to invest in sugar on those lands, because those are beautiful lands, ideal lands, which I'm sure you'll agree with me, but they suffer from a lack of adequate irrigation provisions. And to get the water irrigated, to get the water to irrigate those fields, you have to use electricity, and we have signed an MOU with an organization to provide solar energy to drive those pieces of equipment, and we are hoping that that will come on stream this year. It may not impact the crop this year, but certainly we are hoping that going forward we will have that reduced cost of the energy necessary to drive the water that is necessary to build out Monimus. So if we can get just that 7,000 hectares of land to drive, in addition to New Yarmouth, the volume we need to make the plant at Monimus viable, then I think we'll be on the right road of sustaining, at least sustaining, the livelihood and development of sugar in the Monimus area. We could talk about all the others with all their challenges, but basically we have 4 sugar factories at the moment, and they are all having their respective challenges, but the main challenge facing them right now is the eternal rain that we are getting that makes it impossible for them to reap. So those are some of the problems. Going forward for growth, we are satisfied that with improved weather and giving the farmers an opportunity to plow and plant and prepare the crop for the spring in order to meet the spring rains without flooding and develop the crops, I am hopeful that our first quarter next year, this calendar year, our first quarter will be more productive than the last quarter. But certainly it would be miraculous if it were as productive as the quarter 1 year ago. So we are certain, or 2016. But we are certainly hoping that with all the care that is being taken to prepare the fields and to make sure that all the supplies are provided, the seedlings and all the technical advice and equipment and everything that is being given through the extension services, that we will see a significant improvement, because it's very important for us. I think that's did I say anything? That's about it. The crop cycle. The crop cycle to avoid beet armyworm. Good point. In fact, you know agriculture. Yeah, I like talking to agriculturists. No, don't. So, you're quite right. When you allow, and the farmers have to be educated to this, when you allow produce that is not used to lie fall on the thing, it is a breeding ground for beet armyworm. We are containing it, we are controlling it considerably, and it's not as bad as it used to be. But it's still there because it's something that, quite frankly, we never ever get rid of. But I need to be more careful, and it needs technical advice, it needs training, it needs hands-on cooperation, and so on. And it needs financing to make sure that they are doing the right thing at the right time, and so we don't have any excess crop, and that where markets match our supply output, so we have a balance. And that is the strategy going forward. But Mr. Speaker, with those comments, I close my presentation. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, on September the 13th, 2016, in this Honourable House, I made a statement which referred to the special audit report issued by the Auditor General in respect of the Port Authority of Jamaica, the PAJ. I gave an undertaking to update the nation on the actions that have been taken to address the issues identified in the report. At that time, however, there were certain negotiations that were ongoing, and given the nature of those negotiations and based on legal advice, I was not in a position to comment further. Today, I rise to provide an update in relation to the Auditor General's report on the Port Authority's payment of a discretionary retirement benefit to executives already in receipt of gratuity payments. Mr. Speaker, by way of background, in July 2016, the Auditor General issued a special audit report in which certain key findings were noted. Among these, it was highlighted that there were certain executives of the Port Authority of Jamaica who had a provision in their contracts for the payment of a discretionary retirement benefit. It was noted that the requisite approval was not sought from the Ministry of Finance and Planning prior to making the payment, in breach of the Ministry of Finance's guidelines. These individuals were also the recipients of a contract gratuity in lieu of pension. Mr. Speaker, the report indicated that the Port Authority had informed the Auditor General as to the actions to be taken in treating with the matter. The Auditor General advised the PAJ, that is, in response to the PAJ's request for advice from that office, that persons entitled to contract gratuities would not also be entitled to retirement benefits. In keeping with the advice of the Auditor General, the Port Authority requested the approval of the Ministry of Finance to pay a reduced retirement benefit based on an agreement which was negotiated with the executives. However, before a response was received from the Ministry of Finance, two former executives filed a suit in the Supreme Court against the Port Authority. Declarations that the PAJ acted in error in requesting and acting on the advice of the Auditor General, and that the Port Authority is liable to pay them the full discretionary retirement benefits provided for them in their contracts of employment were sought. Mr. Speaker, given that these issues were now to be determined by the court, the government of Jamaica took no further action whilst awaiting the ruling. The PAJ defended the claims on the basis that the Auditor General was the appropriate officer to advise on the issues and that it acted properly in acting on the advice of that office. On November 30th, 2007, the Supreme Court dismissed all claims brought against the Port Authority. 2017, did I say 16? 2017, forgive me. Dismissed all claims brought against the Port Authority by the two recently retired executives and upheld the Port Authority's position. The court acknowledged the role of the Auditor General and the PAJ's obligation to comply with the directions of that office. And I think that that ruling is a signal to other MDAs. Mr. Speaker, the court found that the Port Authority had the power to grant discretionary retirement benefits, and that in exercising that power, the Port Authority must act rationally and in good faith. The court went on to find that the PAJ did not act irrationally or in bad faith when it sought and followed the advice of the Auditor General. The court specifically considered that it was proper for the Port Authority to seek and consider the Auditor General's advice, given the scope, nature, and functions of the Auditor General and the relevant provisions of the Public Bodies Management and Accountability Act and the Financial Administration and Audit Act. In those circumstances, it would have been prudent for the Port Authority to ignore the Auditor General's opinion. Mr. Speaker, another issue which arose was whether the Auditor General's opinion was legally correct and whether the Port Authority was under an obligation to look behind the Auditor General's opinion. The court held that it was not necessary or even appropriate for any public body, such as the PAJ, to attempt to question or attempt to confirm the accuracy of the Auditor General's opinion. Mr. Speaker, the recently retired executives have filed an appeal against the court's decision. No date has been set for the hearing of the appeal. In the circumstances, unless and until the Court of Appeal makes a different ruling, the Port Authority and the government will be guided by the decision of the Supreme Court. In her report of July 2016, the Auditor General directed that the Port Authority take action to recover the retirement benefits paid to retired senior executives in circumstances where the payments were not authorized. The PAJ had initially delayed taking action pending the court ruling, but now that it has been handed down, the PAJ has initiated steps to recover the payments that had been made. Mr. Speaker, we are all aware that the report deals with additional issues which I have not addressed today. I will update the House further in relation to those specific details, but I wish to highlight at this time that the board of the PAJ has taken the necessary steps to implement the enhanced risk management framework as recommended by the Auditor General. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Announcements.
Mr. Speaker, before we get to announcements, can I just, normally at the start of the new calendar year, we would wish each other Happy New Year, so I'd like to do that. But no, that's not the main reason. But, Mr. Speaker, I would just like to inquire, though, because we haven't heard anything from the House Leader, and we are concerned about his health, so I would like to inquire of the House Leader of his health. We want to wish him all the best, and to see, especially in light of what we have seen in the newspapers, what is the true state of our House Leader, who we really regard with the highest regard.
It was intended that at the end of today's proceeding, statement will read. Announcements.
Mr. Speaker, before you proceed, and hopefully with your permission, Mr. Speaker, and with the indulgence of the Prime Minister, the regulations as required by law for the
under the Emergency Powers Act have been laid before us, as is required. And while obviously it doesn't require parliamentary approval at this point, I would want to just make a couple of observations that could assist. We are on record, Mr. Speaker, as supporting the declaration of the state of emergency. So that's not the issue.
Mr. Phillips, 1 minute, please.
Mm-hmm. The issue, Mr. Speaker, is that it has not yet been laid officially. So as soon as it's laid, then you can make your comment.
Is that okay?
Thank you. Laid on the table of the House today are the following. Minister Paper Number 1, Cabinet Agenda Issues dated October 2, 10, 17 and 23 of 2017 and November 6, 13, 20 and 30, 2017. Minister Paper Number 9, an annual reports of the University Hospital of the West Indies for the years 2010 to 2013. Minister Paper Number 13, an annual report of the Management Institute for National Development for the year 2013-2014. Ministry Paper Number 14, an annual report and audited financial statements of the Rural Agricultural Development Authority for the year ending March 31, 2016. Ministry Paper Number 15, an annual report of the National Family Planning Board for the year 2014-2015. Ministry Paper Number 16, an annual report of the Pesticides Control Authority for the year 2013-2014. Annual report of the Council of Community Colleges of Jamaica for the year 2012-2013. Auditor General's Department Information Systems Review Report of the Tax Administration Jamaica's Information Technology Governance and Business Continuity Management. Auditor General's Annual Report on the results of the examination of the accounts of the island for the year ended March 31, 2017. Annual Report for Devon House Development Company, DHDC, for the year 2016-2017. Annual Report of the Land Administration and Management Program, LAMP, for the year 2010-2011. Annual Report on Audited Financial Statements of the Jamaica Ultimate Tire Company Limited for the year 2015-2016. Annual Report of the National Water Commission for the years 2013-2014 and 2014-2015. Annual Report for the E-Learning Jamaica Company Limited for the year 2016-2017. Annual Report on Audited Financial Statements for Chase for the year 2016-2017. Annual Report on Financial Statements of the National Library of Jamaica for the year 2014-2015. Annual Report on Audited Financial Statements of the Women's Centered Foundation of Jamaica for the financial year 2014-2015. Annual Report on Audited Financial Statements of the Jamaica Information Service for the year 2015-2016. Jamaica Agricultural Commodities Regulatory Authority Regulations 2018, Resolution under the Jamaica Commodities Regulatory Act. Jamaica Agricultural Commodities Regulatory Authority CES Regulations 2018, Resolution under the Jamaica Commodities Regulatory Act. The revised National Quality Policy and Implementation Plan, the Financial Investigation Division's Annual Report for the fiscal year 2014-2015, the Emergency Powers Regulations 2018 under the Emergency Powers Act. Certified Appropriation Accounts, Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade, 2015-2016, Office of the Cabinet, 2014-2015, Ministry of Tourism and Entertainment, 2014-2015, 1700A and 1700B. Director of Public Prosecutions, 2015-2016, and Minister of Finance and the Public Service, 2015-2016.
Any message to Lisa?
Bills brought from the Senate.
Mr. Speaker, if I might, again with your permission and the indulgence of the House,
I would want it, now that these regulations have been laid before us, to just bring a couple of matters to the attention of the House and through you to the Prime Minister, which arising from these regulations. I think we all know that in the circumstances of a state of emergency having been declared, enormous powers now fall to the security forces and the other authorities of the state in the areas. And I must say that we are particularly pleased. We did raise the question of ensuring that there was appropriate oversight and the possibility of redress. The powers exercisable include the power of detention, the power to confine somebody to house arrest, the prohibition of rights of assembly, etc., and many others. But we are pleased that in Section 38 here, there is a provision for the establishment of a tribunal for review of cases of detention or restriction, which is, as I said, in order. Certainly we support it. I would wonder, however, since this tribunal is restricted in its powers to only review cases of detention and restriction, and I would want to urge after the 14-day period or before, preferably, that it be empowered to look at any other abuse, any other alleged abuse that of the rights of a citizen that may arise, so that you may be detained or you may not be detained. You might want to claim that your property has been improperly taken away, or you may claim that you have been treated improperly, abused, physically abused or something, just to allow for the strengthening of the oversight powers of the review of the tribunal to be appointed. Just to bring that particular point to attention. Also, Mr. Speaker, there is a competent authority is established, and it says here, competent authority has the right to do many things, including confine you to your residence, detain you, prohibit other people from relating to you, and all of these things. Now, the competent authority speaks here refers here, as it says in the definition, to either the Governor General, the Minister responsible for national security, the Chief of Defense Staff, the Commissioner of Police, each Deputy Commissioner of Police, or the senior officer in each parish. When it comes, however, to detention orders, the power under Section 33 here is reserved, 33(1), it says is reserved for the minister. I understand that executive authority is exercisable through a minister. And it says here, just to quote, the minister, if satisfied that any person has been concerned in acts prejudicial to public safety or public order in the preparation or investigation of such acts, or that any person thereof, etc., may be detained. It perhaps would make it clearer that the minister was acting on the advice of the competent authority and would remove from any doubt whatsoever that the minister was acting on his own to detain or restrict a person's authority. And thus, we could say the minister, on recommendation of the Commissioner of Police or the Chief of Defense Staff, may or should or can, like Zozo has it. And similarly, it applies in 34 and 32, because the minister, in accordance with what is before us, may, for any person outside of the area who they consider could have been arrested or detained in the community that is within the area in which the state of emergency has been declared, may define that person as a person of special national security interest and thus detain them. So, if you had been resident in St. James, or for some other reason, it is determined that under the powers you could be arrested and detained in St. James, even though you are now in Portland, you could be detained if you are declared by the minister to be a person of special national security interest. I understand the tradition from which the wording came, but again, I think it would be best stated that the minister, in exercising that power, would be acting on the advice and recommendation of the Commissioner of Police or the Chief of Defense Staff as the competent authority. And my final comment in relation to Section 39, where it says, and I quote, "The competent authority or any other person by whom an order is made in pursuance of these regulations shall," and I'm quoting here, "shall publish notice of the order in such manner as he may consider best adapted for informing persons affected by the order." Which in effect it might say that if I intend to detain you, I could put up a notice on the light post closest to your residence, and that would be appropriate. I think at minimum I would urge that there be publication in the national newspapers of these orders, even as we allow for the other methods to be employed as well, so that we know that we set a minimum standard that would enable any member of the public concerned, whether directly or indirectly, to know what are the requirements that have been placed on other citizens or on that citizen by the competent authority. As I said, we're not doing this to cavil or to oppose the provisions, but we think that it would go some distance in protecting the rights of citizens. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, the law only requires for as was said by the Leader of the Opposition, for the regulations to be tabled. And I don't want to set up a precedence in these matters. The Leader of the Opposition has made recommendations. These regulations, we are not saying are perfect, but we take the recommendations of the Leader of the Opposition. I was consulting with counsel to see what improvements can be made. It is highly likely that we will be back here asking for the extension. At that time, we probably will have to incorporate the suggestions made by the opposition in improving this document. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Petitions, papers, reports from committees, notices of motions given orally. report from the committee.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice that at the next meeting of the House, I will move, be it resolved that the Regulation Committee of the House of Representatives and its deliberations on the National Housing Trust, Housing Benefits, Special Selection, Estuary Housing Development, Order 2017, which was laid on the table of the House on the 6th day of December 2017, be approved.
Doctor.
Mr. Speaker, permission to speak from a seat other than my own.
Go ahead.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice that at the next meeting of the House, I will move to introduce, and I've read a first time, a bill shortly entitled the Telecommunications Spectrum Regulatory Fees, Validation and Indemnity Act 2018.
Mr.
Shamuda.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice that at the next meeting of the House, I will move the following motion. The Agricultural Commodities Regulation Authority Act. The Jamaica Agricultural Commodities Regulation Authority Regulations 2018 Resolution. Whereas Section 37 of the Jamaica Agricultural Commodity Registry Regulation Authority Act, hereinafter referred to as the Act, provides that the authority may, with the approval of the Minister, make regulations for the purpose of giving effect to the provisions of the Act. And whereas subsection 4 of Section 37 of the Act provides that regulations made under subsection 1 of the section shall be subject to affirmative resolution, and whereas the authority, with the approval of the Minister responsible for agriculture, on the 10th day of January 2018, made the Jamaica Agricultural Commodities Regulation Authority Regulations 2018. And whereas it is desirable that the Jamaica Agricultural Commodity Regulatory Authority Regulations 2018 be affirmed, now therefore be it resolved by the House of Representatives as follows. 1. This resolution may be cited as the Jamaica Agricultural Commission's Regulation Authority Regulation 2018 Resolution. 2. The Jamaica Agricultural Commodities Regulatory Authority Regulations 2018, which were laid on the table of the House on the 23rd day of January 2018, are hereby affirmed. Mr. Speaker, the Jamaica Agricultural Commodities Regulation Authority Act, the Jamaica Agricultural Commodities Regulation Authority CES Regulation 2018 Resolution. Whereas Section 37 of the Jamaica Agricultural Commodity Regulation Authority Act, hereafter referred to as the Act, provides that the authority may, with the approval of the Minister, take regulations for the purpose of giving effect to the provisions of the Act. And whereas subsection 4 of Section 37 of the Act provides that regulations made under subsection 1 of the section shall be subject to affirmative resolution. And whereas the authority, with the approval of the Minister responsible for agriculture on the 10th day of January 2018, made the Jamaica Agricultural Commodities Regulation Authority CES regulation in 2018. And whereas it is desirable that the Jamaica Agricultural Commodities Regulatory Authority CES regulation 2018 be approved, be affirmed. Now therefore, be it resolved by the House of Representatives, 1. This resolution may be cited as the Jamaica Agricultural Commodities Regulatory Authority CES Regulations 2018 resolution. Resolution 2, the Jamaica Agricultural Commodities Regulatory Authority CES regulations, which were laid on the table of the House on the 23rd day of January 2018, are hereby affirmed. Mr. Speaker, thank you very much, but I just want to indicate that this is one of the most important pieces of legislation in terms of agriculture that has been passed through this Honourable House. Now the regulations are in place. When it goes from here and is completed, Mr. Speaker, JACRA will be a reality.
Mr. Chuck.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice that at the next sitting of the House, I will move to introduce and have read the first time the following bills, shortly entitled: 1, the Child Diversion Act 2018, 2, the Trafficking in Persons Prevention, Suppression and Punishment Amendment Act 2018, and 3, the Child Care and Protection Amendment Act 2018.
Questions? Questions and answers to questions. Motions that may be made at the commencement of public business requiring notice. Motions relating to the sittings of the House. Motions for leave to introduce bills.
Mr. Speaker, I now seek leave to introduce and I read a first time a bill shortly entitled the Banking Services Amendment Act 2017.
Those in favor? Those in favor? Those against? Mr. Jackson.
Mr. Speaker, in keeping with standing order.
Have a seat. Members, I have been advised that I should put the questions, and as such, no member of the Parliament has responded.
I did, Mr. Speaker. You may not have heard me, but I did.
You voted in favor, Mr. Jackson? Mr. Jackson, leave is granted for you to proceed. Mr. Jackson.
Mr. Speaker, in keeping with Standing Order 48(1), I now move to introduce and have read a first time a bill shortly entitled the Banking Services Amendment Act 2017.
A bill shortly entitled the Banking Services Amendment Act 2017, read a first time.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice of second reading of the bill, which I intend to take at the next sitting of the House.
Presentation of bills without leave of the House first obtained. Public business.
Mr. Speaker, on the public business, the Minister of Justice will move that the bill entitled an act to make more comprehensive provisions for the appointment of jurisdiction and conduct of justice of peace be now read a second time. It will also move for an act to provide for the courts of petty session to be renamed Lay Magistrates Court to be amended the Judiciary Parish Court Act. We know, but I didn't ask the second time. Didn't ask.
Go ahead, Mark.
Mr. Golden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I wish to thank the Minister for having afforded me the opportunity to comment on these two bills, one of them in particular, before he closes the debate. And essentially, I have a few points that I want to bring or to make for his consideration. But before I do that, I would just preface my remarks by saying essentially what this bill is doing is further defining the regulatory aspect of justices of the peace, bringing clarity to important relationships and how they should work between JPs and custodies and the Minister of Justice and so forth. And of course, there is an increase in the monetary upper limit for cases over which justices of the peace have jurisdiction in what will become lay magistrates' courts, now known as the courts of petty sessions. The policy of the Ministry of Justice for some time, arising out of the reform that was embarked on in 2007 with the Justice Reform Task Force report, has been to find ways to bring justice to the people through allowing justices of the peace who operate in communities and are closer to the population to play more of a role in delivering justice. And I am hoping that we will see more to come in terms of ways in which we can expand their role, and I'm sure that that will be something to look forward to, whether it be through giving them jurisdiction over a broader range of cases which may now have to be tried in, for example, the traffic courts and so on. I just wanted to comment on a few details in the bill for the Minister's consideration, as I said before. And I'm referring here to the more substantial bill, which is shortly entitled the Justice of the Peace Act 2017. The first point I would note, and this is just it occurred to me that the advisory committee that is being established in relation to justices of the peace, there is no private sector representation on that advisory committee. The Custos chairs it, the most senior parish court judge or nominee of that judge, also being a parish court judge, sits on it, and the senior police officer for the parish. But I was thinking it may be helpful if, let us say, a representative of the Regional Bar Association would also be there, just to give an additional perspective on the kind of deliberations that they have. I move to page 3 to 4 of the bill. And this is in relation to the appointment of justices of the peace. And there is a provision that, well, this is clause 5 of the bill, and it sets out the role of the Governor General acting on the recommendation of the Minister in appointing justices of the peace. And it sets out the eligibility criteria in subsection 2 and so on. In subsection 3, it says, where the operations of a ministry, department, or agency of government may be facilitated by having ready access to the services of a justice, officers serving in that ministry, department, or agency, as the case may be appointed as justices to facilitate the work of that ministry, department, or agency. It wasn't clear to me whether this was intended to be a separate procedure of appointment to the normal one that is already established and which is being further enshrined in law. And if so, I was wondering what procedure would govern those appointments to ensure that the persons who are appointed are suitably qualified, etc., etc. It wasn't clear to me whether it was just
a different pathway to appointment, and I think it would be helpful for that to be clarified. I move to clause 6, and this is dealing with how people apply or are nominated to the position of a justice of the peace. And it makes a point in 6.1 that a person may apply or be nominated by someone else for appointment. But there's a provision in 3, though, 6.3, which says where an application or nomination in respect of any person for appointment as a JP is made to the custos shall, before acting under subsection 4, which is to proceed with the application further, is required to inform the person that the custos has received the application and that before the application or nomination is sent to the minister, the custos may direct that inquiries are made into that person's background and invite the person to state in writing whether the person agrees to these inquiries being made or would prefer that no further action be taken. I think that in the case of a nomination where a third party is putting you forward, that's a reasonable procedure to follow. But I think in the case of somebody applying of their own volition to be a justice of the peace, it's rather bureaucratic for the custos to have to tell them that inquiries may be made as to their suitability and so on. I think it should be assumed that they know when they're applying that this is part of the procedure. And I don't think we should burden the custodies with this particular requirement in cases where an application is being made by the individual. I agree with it where a third party is nominating you, because you may not even be aware that you're being nominated and in fact not want to be nominated at all. But where you have decided to apply, I don't think this procedure should be necessary. I move to the next page, and this is page 5, which is still in clause 6 of the bill. And subsection 6 or subclause 6 says that the minister shall submit to the Governor General such of the names supplied under subsection 5 as constitute the names of persons whom the minister is prepared to recommend that the Governor General appoint as justices. Now, this is at the very end of the process of the due diligence that is being done. So the earlier provisions in clause 6 talk about what has to happen when an application is received and so on. And there's the advisory committee essentially vets these people to make sure that they're suitable. And then if they are, the recommendations come to the minister for forwarding to the GG. My concern in 6 was that it gives the impression that the minister may decline, for example, to recommend a particular individual for appointment to the GG, and having that person having already been vetted and having already successfully passed through the vetting process. And no criteria is elucidated here as to on what basis a minister may then decline. And, you know, I'm thinking in my own mind, it may be somebody who's a well-known political activist or something on the other side, or, you know, and this sort of thing could arise. And I thought to myself that if the person has passed through the vetting procedure, if you're going to have the minister being able to stop it going forward, there should be reasons at least given for that to happen, if you really want to empower the minister to do that. And so I thought I should mention that to you. I move to page 6, and this is clause 7 of the bill. And this is to do with this is now provisions that are setting the standard for justice of the peace in terms of how they conduct themselves. It's an important section. And it says in 2A, well, first of all, 7.1 I should start with, says that a justice shall observe the provisions of the code of conduct which are in the schedule, and failure to do that is an act of misconduct, and that's an important concept, an act of misconduct. And subsection 2 says a justice shall, and then A, participate in training and educational courses approved by the minister. My question was how many, how often, I thought that those things should be prescribed. In other words, there should be some hint that the requirements for training and educational courses would be a prescribed requirements. So that rather than just say they must participate in training, there must be some standard of how long that is, how many days of training, or how many courses, and so on. So I would have thought the prescribing of that would be important. And since it says courses approved by the minister, I thought it also made the word prescribed would be usefully added somewhere in that clause to make it clear that there will be set standards for this. In B, it requires the justice to agree in writing to certain things. It doesn't say when that person must agree in writing, but the things that the justice is agreeing in writing to are important things. One is to serve the public in relation to the attestation and authentication of documents, and the other is to, whenever possible, and subject to availability, to perform such other community-based activities as the custos may require, such as visits to prisons and to old persons' homes. And given that breach of these requirements in Section 7 are acts of misconduct to which sanctions may apply, it seemed to me that what is mentioned in B1 and B2 should themselves be acts of misconduct. So I don't think it's sufficient to just say that they must agree in writing to it, though I think that is important that they should agree in writing to it. But I think that what is listed there should itself, if violated, amount to an act of misconduct. And it wasn't clear that that is the effect in the way it is written. The obligation in paragraph B is written as being to agree in writing to do these things rather than to actually do them. And I was wondering if there's going to be a prescribed form for this agreement, the agreement that is in writing that the justices are required here to enter into, whether that would be in a prescribed form. I think it should be in a prescribed form. Otherwise, you may find a whole range of different approaches to how you document that agreement. I just moved to the next page, page 7. And this is dealing with a situation where it appears to the custos that a justice has, without reasonable excuse, failed to comply with a requirement under subsection 2, which is that list of activities or behaviors that are expected of a justice. And it says that the custos shall, in writing, if there's been non-compliance, shall remind the justice of the obligation to comply and instruct the justice to give an undertaking to fulfill those requirements, and shall state that if the justice does not give the undertaking, then the justice will be required to resign office, or a recommendation will be made for the revocation of the justice's appointment. And I wondered, what is the situation? What would happen if the undertaking is given by the justice, because the custos has said that the undertaking must be given, but it is subsequently breached? It wasn't clearly covered in the 3rd schedule what the effect of breaching the undertaking is. And I thought that that was a gap there that one could consider filling. I think that the breach of that undertaking ought to have appropriate consequences. In terms of jurisdiction, Minister, which is clause 8, subclause 1 speaks to the parish-based jurisdiction of justices of the peace. And it says at the end of 1 that the custodians shall update the roster referred to in section 18 accordingly. And this is where a justice of the peace has ceased to reside or have his principal place of work in the parish. And but the roster in section 18 is, as I understand it, the roster for those justices that are lay magistrates, in other words, that do judicial work, whereas there is a register in section 16 of all justices of the peace. And it seemed to me that the updating really ought to be of the register, rather than the roster, because the roster is a smaller subset, and not all JPs are going to be lay magistrates. Yes. I notice in clause 9 on page 8 that the tenure of the Justice of the Peace is for life. And I thought that there's no upper age limit on a person, and given the services that they're required to render, authentication of documents and so on, there ought to my mind, there ought to be some upper age limit, because infirmity being the way it is. If the people want you, the people can have you, Daryl. And this is 9 is dealing with tenure, and it says that the tenure of an appointment of a justice is, and in B it says until the appointment is terminated in accordance with this section by 1, the resignation of the justice, 2, the removal of the justice for misconduct or inability to perform. But there's also a provision in 17.3, clause 17.3, which results in a justice being deregistered. And I wasn't sure why there wasn't a reference to that provision here, because it seemed to be another way in which the tenure of the appointment of a justice could come to an end by virtue of 17.3. And I'll move on. There's similarly in clause 10 of the bill, which is on page 9 going over to 10, at the bottom clause, subclause 4, 10.4 says, a justice shall cease to use the instrument of office and the official seal if the justice retires from office, resigns the office, is suspended from office, or, as the case may be, the appointment is revoked. And I again say deregistration under 17.4 ought to be included there as well. As 17.4, that comment is in relation to 10.4, 10.4a. At the top of page 10, where the circumstances in which you're obliged to hand in your seal and your instrument of appointment, I think there should be a reference to 17.4 deregistration as well. And I notice at the end of the clause 10.4, there's no reference to suspension. It only refers to retirement, resignation, or direction, as the case may be. But suspension is referred to higher up in the clause in 4A. And I think it ought to be, for consistency, it ought to be referred to at the end of 4 as well. Thus the word suspension should be included at the very end of 10.4. And, I move to, this is an important point, Minister, on page 11, the use of the official seal. 11.2 says that a document attested to or authenticated by a JP in the execution of his functions or the functions of the office shall not be valid unless the requirements of subsection 1 have been complied with. And subsection 1, it says that every document which is attested or authenticated by a JP shall bear the official seal, the date of execution, and the signature of the justice. And it seemed to me that we shouldn't say that the document is invalid, but we should say that the attestation or authentication is invalid. The document may be a very important legal document. It may be a mortgage or a contract or something that has created important legal rights and obligations. And I don't think the failure to comply with 11.1 should necessarily lead to the document itself being invalid, because that could have serious implications for the parties to that document. But I think it would be better to say that the authentication or attestation isn't valid unless subsection 1 is complied with. It would. I turn to page 12, and this is dealing with clause 13 now. And it just occurred to me that this is to do with the procedure for revoking the appointment of a justice. And I noticed that 13.2 makes the inquiry optional. The word may is used, so there doesn't necessarily have to be an inquiry into whether or not the appointment should be revoked. And I also noticed that the JP is not given a right to be heard during the inquiry. If there is an inquiry, there's no right to be heard during that inquiry. It is only after the inquiry is held and a report is sent to the custos, then the custos is obliged to give the justice an opportunity to be heard. But it seems to me that it would be useful for the JP to be able to be heard in the course of the inquiry itself, because that is where the information and evidence could be tested and so on, and the JP would have the opportunity perhaps to hear what allegations are being made against him or her and respond. So it seemed to me that to put the right to be heard after the inquiry is perhaps a little bit late in the process. And I noticed, Mr. Minister, that in 14.1, once you're charged with or convicted of a criminal offense, then a written report has to be sent to the custos. And I just thought that if you're dealing with a ticketable traffic offense, for example, I don't think this should apply to that. I think this should really apply to other offenses, but not something as basic as a speeding ticket or something. Yeah, I'm sure that wasn't your intention. Yeah, but I'm just saying the way it's written, it covers all criminal offenses. So I think perhaps that should be considered. I move on to page 13, Minister, and this is more an appeal to you on behalf of the lay magistrates. Clause 15 provides that for the avoidance of doubt, it's confirmed that the Office of a Justice of Peace is not an office of emolument, and the functions must be carried out free of charge. And I accept that that is the long history of justices of the peace, and indeed Jamaica is not in a position, I think, to take on the cost of paying justices of the peace. But I do think that where a justice of peace is acting as a judicial officer in court and spending hours in court adjudicating cases, a stipend should be paid for that, because that goes way beyond what the everyday justice of the peace does. And they're giving up their time during the working day to do work for which judges are normally paid. And I'm not suggesting that they may be paid a salary, but some stipend for the lay magistrates could be considered. And I just turned to page 14 to 15, an amendment of the register, which is all in clause 17 of the bill. And clause 3, subclause 3, says that if a justice sends by post, etc., a letter addressed to the person at his address, appearing in the register, this is the JP register now, and receives no reply, and that's a letter inquiring whether the person has ceased to act, and no reply is received within 2 months, the custos shall notify the minister, and the minister may direct the custos to remove that person's name from the register. And my question is that revocation? How does that fit into clause 10.4? I think logically it means that the person is no longer appointed. But there are other provisions which I think would need to refer to this as another pathway by which a JP could cease to be appointed. So have a look at how that fits with 10.4, Minister. That is clause 17.3. 17.3. One point I was going to make, I'm moving on to clause 19 on page 15 now, which is list to be forwarded annually. There is an obligation on the custos to forward to the minister a current list categorized in certain ways, and that must be done in January of each year. But and one of the things that must be included as a category are the justices who have failed to report. as required under Section 7.2d. But I note that those reports under 7.2d are not due, are not overdue until the 31st of January has passed. So you wouldn't be able to report on who is overdue until that deadline had been met. And that deadline doesn't end until the end of January. And the report has to be given in January. So I thought that was a bit strange. I think it should really be, the report should really be after that deadline has passed, because it's only at that time that you would know who has failed to report. And I notice in the offense creating section, which is 20, clause 20, creating certain offenses. In 21C, if you use an official seal after resigning or retiring from office, or your office is revoked by the GG, that's an offense. But what about using it during suspension, for example, or using it after you've been deregistered under 17.3? Those are also circumstances, I think, that should be mentioned here. You shouldn't be allowed to be using the seal when you're under suspension or where you've been deregistered. And there was one other point I thought in the offense-making section. In subsection 3, which is of 20, which is down at the bottom of page 16, it says every person who, and there's a list of behaviors that are made an offense, and this is 20, subsection 3. And I thought falsely holding yourself out as a JP, falsely doing that should be an offense. So be to say I'm a JP and I'm not, I think that should be an offense. And D says falsely holding yourself out as the rightful possessor of an official seal, but I think that's too narrow. I think also, if I go out and start to say I'm a JP and I'm not, that should be an offense, given the powers that JPs have. I think, Minister, on page 19, and this is in the regulation, the amendments to the Justice of the Peace Official Seals Regulations. There's in C, paragraph C, there's a reference to section 14.6 of the Justice of the Peace Act. I'm just asking if you have somebody check that reference, because I had a look at it. I'm being asked to.
The member's time for speaking has expired. House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, motion for extension of time. By 5 minutes, 5 minutes, 5 minutes, Mr. Speaker.
The motion is that the member's time be extended for 5 minutes to allow him to complete his presentation. Those in favor? Those against? Ayes have it.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Minister. As I said, I'm nearly done. Yes, the reference I'm talking to is in clause 24 of the bill on page 19. In paragraph 2C, there's a reference to section 14.6 of the Justice of the Peace Act. No, on page 19 of the bill. It's sir, it's not in the schedule. But there's a reference to section 14.6 of the Justice of the Peace Act, and this is in 24, clause 24 of the bill. 2C. I'm just saying, please check, have somebody check that reference, sir, because I had a look at it and I wasn't sure that it was the correct reference. And the last point I would note in this is in the first schedule, there, which is a code of conduct, there is a provision which I just wasn't sure how appropriate it is. And this is general duties of the Justice of the Peace. And it says in clause 4, and this is on page 22 now, sir, on page 22 of the bill, clause 4 or paragraph 4 of the first schedule. It says, "A justice shall refrain from openly and publicly criticizing the system of administration of justice." And to my mind, in an open society, a democratic society, if a justice feels that the system has deficiencies and wants to say something about that, I don't see why that should be banned or prohibited. To me, that is a fetter on freedom of speech and is a fetter on the ability of a justice to perhaps make useful criticisms. Supposing the justice is addressing a forum where he or her is being asked to comment on the role of the justice of the peace or how the justice of peace fits into the justice system, and there are certain criticisms that the justice feels ought to be brought to the attention maybe of the media or of the persons present. I don't think that should be prohibited by this, and I'm not even sure about the constitutionality of doing so. So Minister, I will close by saying I think overall this is good legislation. I support it, and my comments are purely of a technical nature, just to bring to your attention certain things that jumped out at me when I read it fairly closely, and I commend them to you for your consideration, sir. Thank you very much.
Minister Chuck.
Mr. Speaker, I certainly would like to thank the member from South St. Andrew. And I'm so happy that I delayed the passing of the bill until he was able to speak, because his intellect was brought to bear on the bill. And the effect of it is that we won't go to committee stage this afternoon. I will respond and take into consideration a number of the points you've raised so we can look at. You see, I have a great deal of respect for my colleague from South St. Andrew. We don't always agree, but when he has made excellent comments, then I have to, pay tribute to them. Now, may I say that, in fact, your last comment in relation to clause 4 of the schedule, I believe that first section can be removed, and we will remove it. Now, I agree with you that in time, when we look at the jurisdiction of the justice of the peace, they will be afforded a broad, and that has been something that has been recommended over 10 years. It just happened that during your administration, my administration, we have not extended it, but it's due time that the JPs should be allowed to adjudicate on some of the smaller disputes, not only criminal, but also civil matters in the courts. In respect, I think you made about a dozen comments, and I will just touch on them very briefly. In respect to you said no private sector representation in clause 3. We were going to circulate the amendments, but we're not going to circulate again, because we are going to expand some amendments because of what you have said. But in the clause 3, we had put an additional subclause D, such other persons as are approved by the minister on the recommendations of the custos to serve on the committee, which would be some other JPs or some other persons. So that was already taken into consideration. In respect of Section 5, we brought it over from the old bill, where in the past ministries and MDAs, ministries, departments, and agencies required JPs. So these JPs were appointed from these ministries on the recommendation of the permanent secretary or the minister. But now they will come from these ministries, but they have to go through the same training as all other JPs. And in fact, in discussion with the custodies, even members of parliament, attorneys, and councillors, if they want to get the seal, the custodians feel that they should go through the training, because the 18 hours of training they consider a priority. And I have no difficulty in saying we agree with that. Now, clause 6, clause 6
the question of an inquiry being done if you apply or you're nominated, we don't have, the custos will no longer have to indicate to the person, because on the application form, it will be there that inquiries will be made. So on the application form, you will indicate that in your application or nomination, inquiries will be made, and therefore it's not a question that the custos will go back. So the answer is yes. Now, can the minister, a list having come to the minister, can the minister decline? What usually happens, members, you know, the list comes to the ministry. Once it comes to the ministry, they are vetted, and things are brought to your attention by the various personnel, and especially if the age, especially if the custos did not pick up, bearing the date, the age, the ministry will say, but this man is 71, and at the time 70 was the cutoff point. So you sort of referred back to the custos or say this person has to be taken out because the age limit was 70. Now we have moved that upper age limit completely. And the reason for this is that we have a number of retired persons, such as many of us inside here who are over 70 and who will soon be over 70.
Speak for yourself.
And we are all very energetic, dynamic, and can continue to serve the community. And there are many 70-plus septuagenarians who are still willing to serve their communities. And if they're willing to continue to serve their communities, and the advisory committee recommend them, I believe they should be allowed to serve. And the question now, how long do they go on? We're leaving it now to the custos to decide based on whether the person is still fit, capable, and capable. Because in all sincerity, member, I have met some justices of the peace in their 90s who are still being called, who still attest and are still quite mentally alert. No, so age is just now a number, member. In truth, there's no doubt that there may be some 70 or even 60s persons who have lost it. But there are many persons in their 80s and 90s who are still very capable. So you don't want to put an age limit and say, at 90 you can no longer serve. A lot will depend on whether or not you're still capable, as to be decided by the custos. Now, in terms of Section 7, the number of training, the ministry will put on several series. I have said, rather than put a fixed number, that they attend a training session. And these annual reports, as you pointed out, will be sent in to the custos, and the custos will be able to make an assessment of whether or not the persons are still very active. Certainly, if they're not mentally alert, they may not be able to go, and then that might be a good reason to ask them, is it appropriate for you to resign, as the case may be. Now, in relation, member, to the report and the undertaking to respond, the idea is that the custos needs a report to know that you're still living in the parish, you have not migrated, you're still very active. So if a report has not been sent in, then the custos can ask for you to send in a report or give an undertaking to send one in. And as you quite rightly said, nothing was put if the undertaking is not satisfied. But if having given an undertaking to send in a report and you fail to send it in, then it's clear that you have violated and you have misconducted yourself. Well, so that is something which could be tidied up. Now, may I just say that in relation to the failure to undertake in the third schedule, paragraph 7 dealt with that, okay, in the third schedule. So we can have a look at that. In terms of the removal from the registry, right. we will tidy up that because you indicated we'll tidy that up a bit. You see, in terms of how you're removed from the registry, you have pointed out that in one section, I think it is 17.3, it must fit in with 10.4, so we'll put that in and tidy that up. And you're quite right that the custos cannot make a report to the minister by the end of January if all the reports are going to be in by the deadline. So what we'll probably do is to say in the first quarter by the end of March. So that particular section 19, rather than in January, we have to say by March of the following, the 1st of March, because that would be inconsistent with the report. And then section 21, the question of when you're deregistered, all of that should be put in. And I agree with you that holding yourself out as a JP should be also be an offense because you'll be fraudulently representing yourself. Section 10.4 also provides for custos to direct a JP to cease using the seal in the case of a suspension. And in relation to the criminal offense, it may be that we put serious criminal offense because your idea just of a criminal offense, you're quite right, a minor criminal offense, such as, I better not say, a minor criminal offense should not be a basis to remove, to suspend you.
An offense is an offense.
You see, no, a JP that assaults someone, say, and has good justification for assaulting the person. As I know, my colleague has good justification. So we have to say serious criminal offense. So, Mr. Speaker, I think the member has alerted me to some minor modification. And I want to thank you, Mark, for bringing that into, so that what I will do is to postpone the committee stage. So I will take these into consideration, do the necessary adjustment, and so next week we come and clear it up. So members, I really pay tribute to Mark for pointing these things out. Thanks again.
Affirmative.
The what?
Affirmative resolution of the things I moved. So you want us to put it off for next week? All right. We are that function.
Mr. Speaker, I can ask me something.
I'm going to put it off next week.
No, but today.
Thanks a lot.
Just for that meeting.
Mr. Speaker, we ask for suspension on both acts until next week.
Are you rushing?
The motion that the bill be suspended for debate next week? Yes. Those in favour? Those against? As of
Mr. Speaker, it's not intended to do any further business for today, so I ask that the House be adjourned until next week, Tuesday. What date it is at 2 p.m. No, your time.
Members, before I put the motion for adjournment, I wish to bring to your attention that I have received a letter from the member, a former member of Parliament for St. Andrew Northern, Honourable Derek Smith. The Speaker is addressing the House. I expect members to be silent.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, if you're referring to the leader of the House,
no,
or the former leader, then the constituency is not West St. Andrew, not Northern St. Andrew.
Did I say St. Catherine? I have Member of Parliament, St. Andrew, Northwestern, and you say it's not correct? Okay. The Honourable Derek Smith, a senior parliamentarian who served this Parliament for 35 years, has tendered his resignation. We wish to congratulate him for the many years of service to his constituency, to the Parliament, and to the people of Jamaica. Members, you are aware that this is a tough job. And I think that serving for so many years requires the rest of us to wish him well, wish him health, and wish that he be with us for a long time. Thank you very much.
Mr. Speaker, we thank you for the announcement, the news, and for us to place on record our own tribute to the former Member of Parliament for Northwest St. Andrew as a person who has served this Parliament and his constituency with distinction. And we want to, Mr. Smith, as we all agreed, Mr. Speaker, has been a very amiable, friendly, and effective Member of Parliament. We know that he has not been well for some time, and we hope that during this period of his retirement, he will be able to be restored to full health, and we wish him long life and good luck in his retirement.
Mr. Speaker, I concur with the leader of opposition business. He and Derek has worked together for a good while as House leader opposition business, and the reverse positions over the years. But I want to also place on record our appreciation for the work that he has done and the service that's given to this House as leader of the House and in different capacity. So we do hope that he will enjoy good health in his retirement, and wish for him all that is good and gracious in his retirement. And I do hope that God will shine his mercy on him and blessings and protection all the time.
Mr.
Speaker.
Mr.
Speaker.
Desmond, hold it. Yeah, Mr. Speaker.
Members.
Mr. Speaker.
I wish to recognize Mr. Chuck. Go ahead, Mr. Chuck.
Yeah, may I be allowed to speak on two matters? Firstly, in relation to our good friend, Mr. Derek Smith. I had worked words with him and had hope he would be here in. I had hoped, Mr. Speaker, that he would be here in Parliament for us to pay tribute. The truth, Mr. Speaker, is...
Point of order. Mr. Speaker.
What?
Hold on. Mr. Speaker. Just hold on.
No, we are hoping...
Just hold a minute. Mr. Chuck is a former leader of the House. And Mr. Chuck knows better than making such recommendation. That's not the way it's done. That's not, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, that's not the way it's done. That's not the way it's done. A decision is taken, and he knows better than that, to allow it to go through its process, and an appropriate resolution is moved for it to be done with.
Mr. McKenzie.
Mr. Speaker,
I had intimated that's what I think should be done. That's all I wanted to say. The second...
I understand, Mr. Chuck. No problem.
All right. Go ahead.
Mr. McKenzie, you made an indication. Come. What's the name of the people? I have members. I have also to remind you the Parliamentary workshop commencing tomorrow and Thursday at the Pegasus, and we are asking members of Parliament, please represent our Parliament there. There's also a reception this evening being put on by President of the Senate and the Speaker of the House, represent our parliamentarians, and we are asking you, please, to attend. You are invited. At this time, I wish to put the resolution that the House be adjourned until next week, Tuesday, 13th. At the 13th, 30, at 2 members, at 2 o'clock. Those in favor? Those against? As of it. This Honourable House now stands adjourned.
You can accomplish what you will.
Jamaica to the world.
There'll be a better tomorrow. 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 There'll be a day. There'll be a way. There'll come a time to sing a brand new song. There'll be a better tomorrow.
Wait, you see that sexy thing over there in the red dress?
Yeah, boy, she real cute.
So what happened? You can't dance with me? So what you on the dance floor if you don't want a man to dance with you? Something wrong with you?
Easy now, man. What if she was your sister? Would you want somebody to treat her like that? You're only making me shame. Man, tell the girl sorry.
Hey, I'm Simone. It's really nice to meet a gentleman.
Taurus Riley, Janine Bailey, and Richie Loops make good music.
If you use music for any commercial purpose, you need a JCAP license.
Of course.
and I benefit when my music is used commercially.
JCAP, the Jamaica Association of Composers, Authors and Publishers, protects the rights of its members and worldwide creators of musical works by issuing licenses for the use of these works.
If you use music for any commercial purpose,
you need a JCAP license.
Comply with the law.
Call JCAP at 948-5937 and 948-6439.
Get a JCAP license now.
Jamaica. We can do so much as individuals.
But together, we are forced to be reckoned with.
The world loves us. They love our music, our good body culture,
our athletes, our lifestyle.
But have we been loving ourselves and each other?
We have lost over 100 of our brothers and sisters since the start of 2017.
And we recorded a total of 68 murders by domestic violence alone in 2016.
Do we really love